Hey everyone, welcome back. I've got another collection of stories tonight that'll make you question how people function in society. Sometimes the best stories are the ones where someone's arrogance becomes their own worst enemy, and trust me, this one delivers on that front. Before we dive into everything, I just want to say, you all have been going crazy with the support lately. I honestly didn't expect this many people to show up, comment, and show love. Thank you, for real. It means a lot. Let's start with a story that hits hard because it involves the two people who should have your back no matter what, your partner and your family. Imagine planning your future with someone, trusting them completely, only to find out they've been calling your parents dead weight while literally robbing them blind. I thought I'd found the one. Sarah was everything I thought I wanted. She had this energy about her, ambitious, driven, the kind of person who walked into a room and made things happen. She had a good job in marketing, dressed well, knew how to talk to people. My friends loved her. My co-workers were jealous. For the first year, everything felt easy. We moved in together after 8 months, got engaged at 14. The ring cost me 3 months' salary, but watching her face light up made it worth every penny. I genuinely believed we were building something real. My parents were excited too at first. My mum kept talking about grandkids. My dad offered to help with the down payment on a house. They weren't rich by any means, just middle-class people who worked hard their whole lives and wanted to see their son happy. But I started noticing these little comments from Sarah. Small things. She'd make jokes about my dad's outdated career advice or my mum's decorating taste. I laughed them off as generational differences. Everyone's parents embarrass them sometimes, right? Then came the family dinner. My parents had invited us over for Sunday roast, something they did once a month. Sarah had been stressed about work, some big campaign that wasn't going well, and I could tell she wasn't in the mood. But we went anyway because my mum had been asking for weeks. Dinner was fine at first, normal conversation, nothing heavy. Then my dad mentioned he was thinking about retiring early, maybe traveling a bit while they were still healthy enough to enjoy it. He asked if we'd be okay without their financial help for the house down payment since they'd need those savings. Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully and smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. It was the smile she used on clients she didn't like. She said, and I remember the exact words, that it was probably for the best, since they'd just be dead weight on our finances anyway. My mum's face went pale. My dad just stared at his plate. I tried to laugh it off, said she was joking, but Sarah doubled down. She said my parents had a habit of making financial decisions without thinking about how it affected us, and maybe some distance would help everyone set better boundaries. The rest of dinner was brutal. Nobody knew what to say. My mum excused herself early to clean up. My dad turned on the television. We left 20 minutes later. In the car, I asked Sarah what the hell that was about. She said she was just being honest, that my parents were always going to lean on us financially, and someone needed to say it. I told her that was insane, that they'd never asked us for anything. She said I was being naive. We didn't talk the rest of the drive home. I tried to move past it. Wedding planning was stressful. People say things they don't mean when they're overwhelmed. Sarah apologized a few days later, said she'd been out of line, blamed it on work pressure. I wanted to believe her, so I did. 2 weeks after that dinner, my mum called me. She sounded weird, hesitant, like she didn't want to bother me. She said something strange had happened. Her jewelry box seemed lighter. Not empty, just lighter. A few pieces were missing. My grandmother's engagement ring, the one my mom had promised to give Sarah for our wedding. A gold bracelet my dad had bought her for their 25th anniversary. Another bracelet she'd inherited from her mother. She asked if maybe I'd borrowed them for some reason, to get them cleaned or appraised for insurance. I told her no. She went quiet for a long time, then said maybe she'd just misplaced them. But I knew my mom. She didn't misplace things like that. Those pieces meant everything to her. She kept them in the same velvet-lined box for 30 years, and the timing felt wrong. The only other person who'd been in that house recently was Sarah. We'd gone over the previous weekend so I could help my dad fix a loose door hinge in my mum's bedroom. Sarah had been alone in there for maybe 10 minutes while I was in the garage. I didn't want to believe it. The thought made me physically sick, but I couldn't shake it either. So I did something I'm still not sure was entirely legal. My dad had asked me to come back that week to install a new smoke detector in my mum's room, since the old one kept beeping. I brought a nanny cam with me, one of those ones that looks like a phone charger. I plugged it in on my mum's nightstand, angled toward the dresser where she kept the jewelry box, and told my parents I'd check back in a few days to make sure the smoke detector was working properly. 3 days later, I checked the footage on my laptop, and there it was. Sarah in my mum's bedroom, going through the drawers like she owned the place. She wasn't frantic or rushed, she was methodical. She opened the jewelry box, looked through the contents, held pieces up to the light. Then she pocketed my grandmother's rings, both of the gold bracelets, and a pair of pearl earrings I didn't even know were missing. She closed the box carefully, adjusted the dresser to make sure nothing looked disturbed, and walked out. The whole thing took maybe 4 minutes. I sat there staring at the screen for I don't know how long. My hands were shaking. I felt like I was going to throw up. This was the woman I was supposed to marry, the woman I'd trusted with everything, and she was stealing from my mother, from my family, the same family she'd called deadweight. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to think. I copied the footage to 3 different places: cloud storage, external hard drive, email to myself. Then I called my mum and told her I'd found her jewelry. She asked where. I said I'd explain later, but I needed her to trust me. I went to my parents' house that afternoon and returned everything I could find in Sarah's things. She'd hidden them in a shoebox in the back of our closet, underneath some old sweaters. My mum cried when I gave them back. My dad asked what was going on. I told them I'd handle it. That night, Sarah came home from work in a good mood. She'd closed the campaign that had been stressing her out. She wanted to order takeout and celebrate. I told her we needed to talk. She must have seen something in my face because her smile dropped immediately. I pulled up the footage on my laptop and turned the screen toward her. I didn't say anything. I just let her watch. Her face went through about 5 different emotions in 10 seconds. Shock, panic, anger, and then this cold calculation like she was trying to figure out her next move. When the video ended, she closed the laptop and looked at me. She didn't apologize, she didn't cry. She said she was securing our future. She said my parents were going to drain us dry with their retirement plans and their medical bills and their constant need for help. She said she was being smart, that those pieces would have been mine eventually anyway. So what did it matter if she took them now? We could sell them, put the money toward our house, start our life without being anchored to people who couldn't manage their own finances. I just stared at her. This person I thought I knew. This stranger sitting on our couch justifying theft from my mother. I told her to get out. She laughed. Actually laughed. Said I was being dramatic. That we could talk about this like adults. I told her she had 1 hour to pack whatever she could carry and leave, or I was calling the police. She didn't believe me at first, but when I picked up my phone, she realized I was serious. She started yelling then, calling me ungrateful, saying she'd wasted 2 years on me, that I'd always choose my pathetic family over her. She threw the engagement ring at me. It bounced off my chest and landed on the floor. She packed 2 suitcases, mostly clothes and toiletries, and slammed the door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. Seriously, I need to know I'm not the only one losing sleep over these stories. Now, back to the moment I decided to destroy everything she'd built. I called my parents first, told them everything. My mum cried again. My dad said he'd support whatever I decided to do. Then I called a lawyer, showed them the footage. They said I had a solid case for theft, potentially felony depending on the value of the items. I filed a police report the next morning, gave them copies of the video, descriptions of the stolen items, everything. The police contacted Sarah 2 days later. She tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, that I'd given her permission to borrow the jewelry. But the footage didn't lie, and my parents' testimony backed up my story. She hired a lawyer who tried to negotiate, offered to return everything, pay restitution, avoid charges. But I was done negotiating. I wanted her prosecuted. The DA agreed to press charges. She's currently facing theft charges, and I filed for a restraining order after she showed up at my work, trying to talk to me. The restraining order was granted. Our mutual friends have mostly ghosted me, said I'm being vindictive, that people make mistakes. But stealing from my mother while calling her deadweight isn't a mistake. It's a character reveal. The wedding was supposed to be in 3 months. I cancelled everything. Lost deposits on the venue, the catering, the photographer. I don't care. My mum got her jewelry back. My dad doesn't have to pretend to like someone who disrespected them in their own home. And I don't have to spend the rest of my life wondering what else Sarah would have justified in the name of our future. Some people told me I should have just broken off the engagement quietly. That pressing charges was too much. But here's the thing. She didn't just betray me. She betrayed people who'd welcomed her into their family, who'd offered to help us, who'd done nothing but show her kindness. And she did it without hesitation, without guilt, with this cold calculation that still makes my skin crawl. If I'd let it go, she would have done it to someone else. Maybe she already has. At least now there's a record. I'm not gonna lie, it's been rough. I loved her, or I loved who I thought she was, and untangling those two things has been harder than I expected. But every time I doubt myself, I think about my mum's face when I return that jewelry. The relief, the gratitude, the way my dad hugged me and said I did the right thing. That's worth more than any relationship built on a foundation of contempt and theft. Sarah tried to contact me once more through a friend, said she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to explain, that she still loved me. I didn't respond. What's there to explain? I saw exactly who she was, and I'm grateful I saw it before we signed a marriage license. But that wasn't even close to the worst betrayal I've heard this week. Because sometimes the person recording isn't trying to protect themselves. They're building evidence for something far more sinister. For months, my boyfriend Jake had been acting off. Like, really off. He'd started working late more often, sometimes not coming home until 9 or 10 at night. When he was home, he'd practically guard his phone like it contained nuclear launch codes. If I walked into a room while he was scrolling, he'd flip it face down so fast you'd think I'd caught him planning a heist. Naturally, my brain went straight to the obvious conclusion. He was cheating. Had to be. What else would make someone that paranoid about their phone? I spent weeks feeling like I was losing my mind. I'd catch him staring at me sometimes with this weird, calculating look, like he was studying me. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd just shake his head and say he was tired from work. But his eyes told a different story. There was something cold there, something distant. I started paying more attention to the little things. He'd tense up whenever I got near his laptop. He'd started asking me oddly specific questions about my day, about conversations I'd had, about how I was feeling. At the time, I thought maybe he was trying to figure out if I knew about the affair I was convinced he was having. Then one night, the lamp in our bedroom started flickering. Just a dying bulb, nothing dramatic. I grabbed a replacement from the closet and unscrewed the old one. That's when I saw it, a tiny voice recorder, smaller than a pack of gum, tucked up inside the lampshade. My stomach dropped. For a solid 10 seconds, I just stood there holding this thing, trying to make my brain process what I was looking at. This wasn't some old device that had been left there by a previous tenant. This was new, deliberate, hidden. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. My hands were actually shaking as I turned it over, looking for any indication of how long it had been there. The memory card was nearly full. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding this recorder, and something in me just went cold. This wasn't about another woman. This was something worse. Jake was in the shower. I could hear the water running, could hear him humming some mindless tune like he didn't have a care in the world. I looked at his laptop sitting on the desk, the screen dark but the power light still glowing. I'd never snooped before, never had a reason to, but I walked over to that laptop, opened it up, and started searching. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. He had a folder buried in his documents labeled with dates. Inside were dozens of audio files, months worth. I clicked on one at random. It was me and my best friend on the phone. I was venting about a fight Jake and I had over whose turn it was to do dishes. Completely mundane stuff. I clicked another file. Me talking to my mum. Another one. An argument between me and Jake about his work schedule. He'd recorded everything. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely control the mouse. I kept clicking through files, each one making me feel more violated, more exposed. There were recordings of me crying after a bad day at work, recordings of private phone calls where I'd complained about stress or money or family drama. He'd even recorded me talking to myself while I was cooking dinner, just rambling about nothing. Then I found a document titled Notes. I opened it. My blood turned to ice. Jake had been building a case, an actual case, against me. The document was organized by date and topic. He'd written summaries of the recordings, highlighting moments where I'd been frustrated, emotional, or angry. He'd taken completely normal human reactions and framed them as evidence of instability. There were notes about my tone of voice, about how often I raised my voice during arguments, about times I'd cried or complained or expressed any negative emotion whatsoever. At the bottom of the document, there was a section labeled Custody Strategy. Custody. We didn't have kids, we weren't even engaged. We talked about marriage maybe twice in passing, always in some vague future tense. And this man was already planning a custody battle for children that didn't exist. I sat there staring at that screen, and something inside me just snapped into focus. The paranoia, the weird questions, the way he'd been watching me. He wasn't preparing to leave me, he was preparing to destroy me. You almost have to admire the audacity, like the sheer premeditation it takes to secretly record your partner for months while acting completely normal. To kiss someone goodnight while you've got their entire life catalogued on a hard drive, just waiting to weaponize it. I heard the shower turn off. I closed the laptop, put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and slipped the voice recorder into my pocket. When Jake came out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist, I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone like nothing had happened. He asked what I wanted for dinner. I suggested Thai food. We ate pad thai on the couch and watched some mindless reality show, and the whole time I was thinking about how to burn his entire plan to the ground. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went straight to a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I found someone who specialized in privacy law and illegal surveillance. I walked into her office with the voice recorder, screenshots of Jake's laptop files, and a timeline of everything I'd discovered. She listened to my story with this expression that shifted from professional concern to barely concealed rage. She told me what Jake had done was illegal, incredibly illegal. Recording someone without consent in our state was a felony, especially in a private residence. The fact that he'd been doing it systematically, with clear intent to use the recordings against me, made it even worse. We filed a formal complaint with the police. We documented everything, made copies of copies, built a paper trail that would make a federal prosecutor jealous. Here's where it gets absurd. I went home and acted completely normal. I didn't confront Jake. Didn't let on that I knew anything. I just watched him continue his little surveillance operation, knowing that every single recording he made was digging his hole deeper. My lawyer had advised me to play it cool, let him think he still had control, so that's exactly what I did. 2 weeks later, Jake told me he thought we should break up. He delivered it like he'd been agonizing over the decision, like it was breaking his heart. He said he didn't think we were compatible anymore, that maybe we wanted different things. I nodded along, acted sad, agreed that maybe he was right. We had a very civil conversation about logistics. The lease was in both our names, but he said he'd be willing to let me stay if I covered his portion of the remaining months. I said I needed to think about it. He seemed satisfied with that. Then came the breaking point. 3 days later, I got served with papers. Jake was taking me to small claims court over the lease, claiming I'd damaged his property and owed him money for his share of the security deposit. Attached to the filing were transcripts, actual transcripts of our arguments, pulled from his illegal recordings, where I'd allegedly admitted to breaking his laptop and ruining his clothes. Complete fabrications. He'd taken snippets of conversations completely out of context, edited them together to make it sound like I was confessing to things I'd never done. My lawyer was practically gleeful. She'd been waiting for him to do something exactly this stupid. We showed up to the small claims hearing. Jake showed up with a binder full of his so-called evidence. He actually looked confident, smug even, like he thought he'd already won. The judge asked him to present his case. He started talking about how I'd been emotionally unstable throughout our relationship, how I'd destroyed his belongings in fits of rage, how he had proof of everything. Then my lawyer stood up. She calmly explained to the judge that every single piece of evidence Jake was trying to present had been obtained illegally. She provided documentation of the voice recorder I'd found. She provided the police report I'd filed. She showed the judge screenshots of Jake's own notes detailing his surveillance operation. She walked the judge through every illegal recording, every violation of privacy law, every instance of Jake creating a false narrative. The judge's expression went from mildly interested to absolutely livid in about 30 seconds. Jake tried to backtrack, started stammering about how he'd only recorded conversations for his own records, how he hadn't meant to violate any laws. The judge shut him down so fast it was almost funny. Not only did she dismiss his entire case, she referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Jake walked out of that courtroom looking like he'd been hit by a truck. I walked out feeling like I could finally breathe again. The criminal case moved forward. Jake ended up pleading guilty to illegal wiretapping charges. He paid a fine, got probation, and was ordered to pay my legal fees. The whole amount, every consultation, every filing fee, every hour my lawyer spent dismantling his life. He also had to surrender all the recordings and provide proof that every copy had been destroyed. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone enough rope to hang themselves. Jake spent months building this elaborate plan to paint me as unstable, to control the narrative, to make sure that if we ever split up, he'd have ammunition. And all he managed to do was create a permanent criminal record for himself and hand me the most satisfying legal victory of my life. The lease situation resolved itself pretty quickly after that. Jake moved out within a week, didn't even try to fight me on it. Last I heard, he was living with his parents and working some entry-level job because his felony conviction tanked his career prospects. Meanwhile, I'm still in our old apartment, sleeping soundly in a bedroom that I personally swept for recording devices about 15 times before I could relax. Trust is a funny thing. Once it's gone, it's gone. And Jake didn't just break my trust. He systematically violated it, documented it, and tried to weaponize it. The fact that it all blew up in his face so spectacularly, that's not revenge. That's just consequences finally showing up to do their job. Speaking of people using evidence to destroy lives, let me tell you about the time an entire team tried to pin their incompetence on one person until the truth came crawling out. I thought landing the project-led role for our biggest client pitch was the career breakthrough I'd been working toward for 3 years. This was the kind of account that could define someone's trajectory at the company. High stakes, high visibility, and honestly, high pressure. I was nervous but ready. I had a solid team, a clear timeline, and what I thought was everyone's buy-in. Turns out I was walking into a setup I didn't even see coming. The problem started small. A deliverable here, a missed email there. At first I chalked it up to normal project chaos. We were all working long hours, juggling tight deadlines, and coordinating across departments. But then things started escalating in ways that felt deliberate. Files I'd finished the night before would be corrupted by morning. Key research documents vanished from our shared drive. Deadlines we'd all agreed on suddenly became points of confusion, with team members claiming they'd never been informed. Every time I tried to get us back on track, something else would fall apart. My team started whispering. I'd walk into the break room and conversations would stop. I'd ask for updates in our daily stand-ups and get vague non-answers. Then came the blame. During one particularly tense meeting, my teammate Jessica flat out said that my leadership style was creating confusion. Marcus, the senior guy everyone respected, nodded along and suggested maybe I wasn't ready for this level of responsibility. Others piled on. Suddenly, every missed deadline, every technical glitch, every communication breakdown was because I wasn't managing the team effectively. I started doubting myself. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I'd been promoted too soon. I worked even longer hours trying to compensate, double-checking everything, sending follow-up emails for every conversation. But the problems kept multiplying. It felt like I was trying to bail water out of a sinking boat with a teaspoon. Then came presentation day. This was it. Months of work, dozens of strategy sessions, endless revisions. The client was flying in their entire executive team. Our CEO was attending. This pitch could literally make or break our quarter. I arrived early, triple-checked the presentation file, made sure everything was loaded and ready. The client arrived, we exchanged pleasantries. I opened the deck, half the slides were missing. Not corrupted, not misformatted, just gone. Critical data slides, the entire competitive analysis section, our pricing strategy, all of it vanished. I felt my stomach drop through the floor. I tried to recover, talking through what should have been there, pulling up backup documents on the fly. But you can't fake your way through a multi-million-dollar pitch when your core materials have evaporated. The client's expressions went from interested to confused to politely annoyed. They thanked us for our time and left 20 minutes early. The walk back to the office felt like a death march. My boss called me into his office within the hour. I'd never seen him that angry. He didn't even sit down, just stood there asking me how I could possibly have screwed up this badly. He said the client had already called to say they were going with a competitor. He talked about how much revenue we'd just lost, how this made the entire department look incompetent, how he'd personally vouched for me to leadership. I could see where this was heading. He was building up to firing me. That's when I pulled out my folder. I'd been keeping receipts for weeks, not because I'm naturally paranoid, but because the pattern of problems had started feeling too deliberate to be coincidence. Every time something went wrong, I'd screenshot the timestamps, save the version histories, document who had access to what files. I had Slack messages, email chains, system logs, all of it organized chronologically. I showed my boss the Slack conversation where Jessica asked Marcus if he'd handled the presentation file. I showed him the email thread where my teammate David deliberately withheld client feedback I'd specifically requested, then claimed I never asked for it. I pulled up the shared drives version history, showing that Marcus had deleted key slides from the presentation deck at 11 p.m. the night before the pitch, hours after I'd done my final review. But that wasn't even the worst part. I showed my boss a Slack direct message conversation I'd found by accident when Marcus had briefly shared his screen during a video call. He'd been messaging with Jessica and David about their plan to tank the project. The goal was simple: make me look so incompetent that leadership would remove me as project lead and promote Marcus instead. They'd coordinated the sabotage, they'd agreed on which files to corrupt, which deadlines to miss, how to make it all look like my poor management. They'd literally strategized about how to destroy my reputation. The confidence they had while typing out their little conspiracy was almost impressive. They really thought they'd get away with it. My boss's expression went from angry to absolutely livid, but now the anger wasn't directed at me. He spent the next 20 minutes going through every piece of evidence I'd collected, cross-referencing timestamps, reading message threads. Then he picked up his phone and called HR. Within an hour, Marcus, Jessica, and David were all in separate conference rooms being questioned. The investigation moved fast. Once HR started digging, they found even more evidence I hadn't discovered. Marcus had been bad-mouthing me to other department heads for months, laying groundwork for my failure. Jessica had been feeding our competitors information about our pitch strategy. David had deliberately scheduled conflicting meetings to keep me from coordinating with other teams. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. 3 days later, the company made an announcement. Marcus was terminated immediately for sabotage and violating company ethics policies. Jessica and David were both demoted and transferred to different departments with formal reprimands in their files. They'd also been removed from any projects involving client-facing work. The company's general counsel mentioned that they were lucky the company wasn't pursuing legal action for the revenue loss. My boss called me back into his office, but this time the energy was completely different. He apologized not just for doubting me, but for not seeing the sabotage earlier. He said my documentation and evidence had been textbook professional, that I'd handled an impossible situation with integrity. Then he told me I was getting a formal promotion to senior project lead, a significant raise, and first pick of our next major account. They handed over the rope and tied the knot themselves. I didn't have to destroy them. I just had to keep records while they destroyed themselves. The client situation got resolved too. My boss reached out, explained what had happened, and shared enough sanitized details to make it clear the failure wasn't about our capabilities. We repitched 2 weeks later with a completely new team I personally selected. We won the account. Turns out when you're not being actively sabotaged, you can actually do good work. The whole experience taught me something valuable. When things start going wrong in patterns that don't make sense, trust your gut. Document everything, keep your receipts, and never underestimate how spectacularly people will self-destruct when they think they're smarter than everyone else. Marcus tried to reach out months later, asking if I'd give him a reference for a new job. I didn't even respond. Some bridges you burn, some bridges burn themselves, and some bridges you just watch collapse from a safe distance while taking notes. At least my team only wanted to ruin my career. The next person's brother went after something way more personal, his entire identity. I never thought my own brother would be the person to completely destroy my financial life. Ryan and I weren't super close, but we were family. We talked occasionally, helped each other out when needed, did the whole sibling thing. So when he called me one afternoon sounding stressed, asking if he could borrow my information for a background check on an apartment, I didn't even hesitate. He said his credit was temporarily frozen because of some billing error with his old landlord, and he really needed this place. The apartment complex just needed to verify his identity and run a quick check. He promised it was totally standard, totally safe. I gave him my social security number over the phone. Looking back, I can pinpoint that exact moment as the one where I handed him the keys to completely ruin me. For the next 6 months, everything seemed normal. Ryan and I texted occasionally. He mentioned he got the apartment, thanked me for helping out, sent me a photo of his new place. I was happy for him. Meanwhile, I was saving up for a car. My old sedan was on its last legs, making horrible noises every time I accelerated, and I'd finally scraped together enough for a decent down payment. I walked into the dealership feeling confident. I'd been pre-approved online, had my paperwork ready, picked out the exact model I wanted. The salesman was friendly, started running my information, and then his expression changed. He excused himself, came back with a manager, and they asked me to step into an office. That's when they told me my loan application had been denied. Not just denied, but flagged for risk. My credit score had dropped over 200 points since I'd last checked it. I sat there in that tiny office feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. The manager pulled up my credit report and started reading off accounts I'd never opened. 4 credit cards I didn't recognize. A personal loan from an online lender I'd never heard of. A car lease for a vehicle I'd never seen. Every single one was maxed out or in default. My stomach turned as he kept scrolling. $47,000 in debt. My name, my social security number, my identity, but none of it was actually me. I asked him to print everything. My hands were shaking as I walked out of that dealership with a stack of papers that proved my life had been hijacked. I went straight home and started making calls. Credit bureaus, fraud departments, anyone who would listen. That's when the full picture started coming together. The first credit card had been opened 6 months ago, right around the time Ryan called me. The address on file, his apartment, the phone number, his cell. Every single fraudulent account traced back to him. My own brother had taken the information I'd given him in good faith and built an entire financial house of cards in my name, and he'd done it methodically. He hadn't just opened one card in a moment of desperation. He'd opened 4, spaced out over weeks, so it wouldn't trigger immediate red flags. He'd taken out a personal loan. He'd leased a car. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was calculated. This is where patience finally snapped. I called Ryan, and the second he answered, I could hear it in his voice. He knew. He didn't even try to pretend he didn't know why I was calling. I asked him flat out if he'd opened accounts in my name, and there was this long, horrible silence before he started crying. Actual crying. He said he'd lost his job 3 months after getting that apartment, couldn't make rent, panicked, and thought he could just borrow my identity temporarily. He swore he was going to pay everything back before I ever found out. He kept saying he was desperate, that he didn't have anyone else to turn to, that he thought he could fix it. I asked him how he planned to fix $47,000 in debt while unemployed. He didn't have an answer for that, but that wasn't even the worst part. While he was begging me to understand, to give him time to make it right, I was looking at the payment history on these accounts. He hadn't missed a few payments. He'd missed every single one. From day one, he'd never intended to pay any of this back. He'd taken out cash advances, bought electronics, leased a car he was probably driving around in right now, and left my name attached to the wreckage. The personal loan, $12,000 deposited directly into his account, never touched mine. He'd used my credit like a blank check and set fire to my financial future, without a second thought. I told him I was filing a police report. He started panicking, begging me not to, saying it would ruin his life, that he'd go to jail, that our parents would never forgive me. I asked him if he'd considered any of that before he committed identity theft and fraud. He said he didn't think of it as fraud because we were family. Family. Like that word was supposed to erase $47,000 in debt and a credit score in the gutter. I hung up and immediately froze my credit with all 3 bureaus. Then I filed a police report. Then I started the identity theft recovery process, which is basically a part-time job of affidavits, dispute letters, and phone calls with investigators who ask you to prove you didn't destroy your own credit. Ryan called me 17 times that night, left voicemails that went from apologetic to angry to desperate. He sent texts saying I was overreacting, that we could work this out, that I didn't need to involve the police. Our mom called me the next morning. She'd talked to Ryan, heard his version where he was a victim of circumstances, and I was the cruel sibling destroying him over a mistake. She asked me to drop the charges, to handle it privately, to remember that he was family. I asked her if she'd co-sign a loan to pay off the $47,000 he stole from me. She went quiet. That's what I thought. The police investigation moved faster than I expected. Ryan had been sloppy. He'd used his own address, his own phone number, made purchases that were delivered directly to him. The paper trail was undeniable. He was arrested 3 weeks later and charged with felony identity theft and fraud. Our parents were devastated. They blamed me for pressing charges, said I could have handled it differently, that I was tearing the family apart over money. Over money. Like it was just a few bucks he borrowed and forgot to return. I tried explaining that this wasn't about money. It was about him systematically destroying my financial identity while lying to my face. But they didn't want to hear it. Rebuilding my credit has been a nightmare. Every fraudulent account has to be disputed individually. I've had to file affidavits, provide police reports, explain to creditors that I'm a victim of identity theft. And no, I didn't lease a Dodge Charger or open a credit card with a $10,000 limit. Some companies closed the accounts immediately. Others have fought me every step of the way, insisting I must have authorized it because the social security number matches. I've spent hours on hold, sent certified letters, disputed the same accounts multiple times. My credit score is slowly climbing back up, but it's going to take years to fully recover. Ryan took a plea deal. Felony fraud, probation, restitution payments that'll probably take him decades to actually pay off. Our parents still think I'm heartless for not dropping the charges. They've told me I chose money over family, that I destroyed his future, that I should have been the bigger person. But here's the thing, I didn't destroy his future. He destroyed mine, and when I refused to let him get away with it, he faced consequences. That's not me being heartless. That's me protecting myself from someone who proved they'd sacrifice me without hesitation. I don't regret filing charges, not for a second. Ryan didn't borrow my identity in a moment of panic. He weaponized it, burned through every dollar of credit he could squeeze out of my name, and left me to deal with the fallout. Family or not, that's not something you just forgive and move past. Some people hear this story and think I'm cold for turning in my own brother, but those people aren't the ones who had to sit in a dealership and find out their credit was in ruins because someone they trusted saw them as an easy target. You almost have to admire the audacity of thinking, family loyalty means immunity from consequences. He genuinely believed I'd just absorbed the damage and let him walk away. And honestly, if our parents had their way, that's exactly what would have happened. Family betrayal cuts deep, but at least it usually stays private. The next story involves a boss who thought mixing business with pleasure was consequence-free, until someone called his bluff. My boss Derek had always been demanding, but there's a difference between high standards and targeted harassment. For 3 years, I'd worked under him without major issues. My performance reviews were consistently good. I met deadlines, exceeded targets, and generally kept my head down and did the work. Then he asked me to do something I couldn't ignore. He wanted me to falsify a compliance report. Nothing huge, just some numbers shifted around to make our department's metrics look better than they actually were. He framed it as creative interpretation, said everyone did it, that I was being naive if I thought the executives cared about perfect accuracy. But the thing is, compliance reports exist for a reason. People can get hurt when safety metrics are manipulated. Regulations exist because someone learned a lesson the hard way. So I told him no. Politely, professionally, but firmly no. His entire demeanor toward me changed overnight. Suddenly nothing I did was good enough. Reports I'd been filing the same way for years were now formatted incorrectly. Projects I'd completed successfully were now examples of poor judgment. He started CCing HR on emails criticizing my work, building a paper trail. In our one-on-ones, he'd make comments about how maybe I wasn't the right fit for the role anymore, how the company needed team players who understood how things really worked. The writing was on the wall. He was setting me up to fire me. But here's the thing. While Derek was busy constructing his case against me, I noticed something else happening. His assistant Michelle had started getting preferential treatment. She'd been hired 8 months earlier, fresh out of college with minimal experience. Nice enough person, but objectively underqualified for most of the responsibilities she was suddenly being given. Within 3 months of my refusing to falsify that report, Michelle had been promoted twice. She was now making more than people who'd been with the company for 5 years. Derek's calendar also started looking weird. Lots of afternoon meetings with no details listed. He'd leave early multiple times a week for vague client dinners. But when I'd follow up about those clients, there was never any documentation, no emails, no meeting notes, and Michelle's schedule aligned suspiciously well with his disappearances. I'm not naturally a suspicious person, but when someone's actively trying to destroy your career, you start paying attention to patterns. One afternoon, Derek left for one of his mysterious meetings and forgot his coffee mug on the desk. When I went to grab it to rinse out, I saw a hotel receipt tucked under some papers. The Riverside Inn, a boutique hotel about 20 minutes outside the city, charged to his corporate card. I took a photo of it. Then I started looking more carefully at the expense reports that occasionally crossed my desk for processing. More hotel charges, restaurant bills for two at romantic spots downtown, all on the company dime, all during work hours, all with no legitimate business purpose I could verify. And here's where it gets absurd. Derek called me into his office one morning and told me I was being put on a performance improvement plan. 30 days to show significant improvement, or I'd be terminated. The plan was absurd, contradictory goals designed to be impossible to meet. When I asked for specific examples of my performance issues, he gave vague answers about attitude and team cohesion. I asked if this had anything to do with the compliance report. He said I was being paranoid and defensive, which just proved his point about my poor attitude. I left that meeting knowing I had 30 days to either save my job or burn the whole thing down. I started documenting everything obsessively. I saved every email Derek sent criticizing my work, cross-referenced them with my actual performance metrics that contradicted his claims. I kept a log of every time he left early with Michelle, every suspicious expense report, every instance of her getting opportunities that should have gone to more senior staff. I filed Freedom of Information requests for his corporate card statements. I documented the timeline of when I refused to falsify the report and when my treatment changed. The breakthrough came when Michelle accidentally sent an email to the wrong group thread. It was meant for Derek, something about confirming their reservation for the weekend. She realized her mistake within seconds and tried to recall it, but I'd already screenshot it. The timestamp, the familiar tone, the casual intimacy of the message. It was the smoking gun I needed. 2 weeks into my performance improvement plan, HR called me in for a review meeting. Derek was there looking smug. The HR director started talking about performance concerns, about whether this role was the right fit for me. I let her talk for about 3 minutes, then I pulled out my folder. I'd organized everything chronologically. First, evidence of my actual performance, including metrics that showed I was outperforming most of my department. Then, the timeline of Derek asking me to falsify the compliance report and my refusal. Then, documentation of how my treatment changed immediately afterward. Every critical email, every negative performance note, all dated after that conversation. Then came the breaking point. I showed them the hotel receipts, the expense reports for romantic dinners, Michelle's suspicious promotions and salary, increases despite her lack of qualifications, the email she'd sent by mistake. Bank statements I'd obtained through legitimate channels showing a pattern of company funds being used for personal expenses. Calendar records showing Derek and Michelle's schedules mysteriously aligning several times a week. The HR director's expression went from professional neutrality to barely controlled fury in about 30 seconds. Derek started stammering, trying to explain that the expenses were legitimate client entertainment, that Michelle's promotions were merit-based, that I was clearly retaliating for being put on a performance plan. But the evidence was overwhelming. You can't charge the same hotel room twice a week for 6 months and call it client development. HR ended the meeting immediately. They told Derek not to return to his desk and escorted him to a conference room. They told me to go home for the day while they conducted an investigation. I drove home feeling like I'd just survived a car crash, shaking but weirdly calm. The investigation took a week. They interviewed Michelle, other team members, reviewed financial records. Apparently, once they started digging, they found even more irregularities. Derek had been using company resources for personal trips with Michelle for almost a year. He'd approved her promotions without going through proper HR channels. He'd retaliated against other employees who'd questioned his decisions, though none as systematically as he'd targeted me. The company fired Derek for ethics violations, misuse of company funds, and creating a hostile work environment. Michelle was transferred to a different department and demoted back to her original level. Her promotions were deemed inappropriately granted and rescinded. And me? They offered me Derek's position. This feels like a deleted scene from a sitcom, except it's real and the consequences actually stuck. Derek thought he could bury me for not playing along with his games. Instead, he buried himself by being so arrogant, he didn't even bother hiding his tracks properly. I accepted the job. My first act as department head was implementing a new compliance review process with external oversight. No more creative interpretation, no more looking the other way. Funny how that works. I heard through the grapevine that Derek tried to sue the company for wrongful termination. His lawyer dropped the case within a month once they saw the evidence. Michelle quit about 6 months later. Last I heard, Derek was working at a much smaller company making a fraction of his old salary, and his wife had filed for divorce. Turns out she'd had no idea about the affair until the company investigation became public record. I don't feel bad about any of it. He came after my livelihood because I wouldn't compromise my ethics. All I did was document the truth and let the consequences play out. If that's revenge, it's the most justified kind. Some secrets are kept for years before they detonate. And weddings, they're basically pressure cookers for truth bombs, especially when someone's been holding on to something explosive. My sister Emma had been planning her wedding for over a year. Every detail was perfect. The venue, the flowers, the carefully curated guest list. She'd spent months obsessing over seating arrangements, making sure certain family members were strategically separated to avoid drama. She wanted this day to be flawless, picture perfect, the kind of wedding people would talk about for years. And honestly, for most of the day, it was. The ceremony was beautiful. Emma looked stunning. Her fiancé David was tearing up at the altar. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Then came the reception. Dinner had wrapped up, people were mingling, the dance floor was starting to fill. That's when my Uncle Rick decided it was toast time. Uncle Rick is that family member everyone has, the one who gets a little too comfortable after a few drinks and starts saying things that should probably stay inside his head. He's harmless most of the time, just awkward and overly sentimental. But put some whiskey in him at a family event and he becomes a liability. He grabbed a microphone without asking, tapped it a few times to get everyone's attention, and launched into what I can only describe as a speech nobody asked for. He started off normal enough, talked about watching Emma grow up, how proud he was of the woman she'd become, all the standard wedding toast stuff. People were smiling politely, waiting for him to wrap it up so he could get back to dancing. But then his tone shifted. He started talking about adversity, about overcoming challenges, about how not everyone gets a second chance at happiness. I saw my mum tense up at her table. My dad was already halfway out of his seat, probably trying to figure out how to tactfully get the microphone away from him. Then Uncle Rick said it. Just dropped it right there in front of 150 people. He said he was so proud of Emma for how far she'd come, and that not many people could bounce back from giving up a baby at 16. The room went dead silent, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire reception. You could hear glasses being set down on tables. The DJ had stopped the music between songs, and the timing made the silence even more brutal. I looked at Emma and watched all the color drain from her face. She looked like she'd been physically struck. David, her fiancé, was sitting right next to her. His expression went from confused to something I can't quite describe. Not angry yet, just processing, trying to figure out if he'd heard that right. Emma immediately started damage control. She laughed, this horrible forced laugh, and said Uncle Rick was drunk and confused. She tried to wave it off as him mixing her up with someone else, maybe a cousin or family friend. She was talking fast, almost frantic, trying to bury the comment under explanations and deflections. But Uncle Rick wasn't done. He actually doubled down. He looked genuinely confused by her reaction and said no, he definitely meant Emma. He even named the adoption agency, said he remembered because he'd helped my parents find it. He talked about how mature she'd been about the whole thing, how hard it must have been at that age. He was trying to be supportive, trying to give a heartfelt toast about resilience, and he had no idea he was detonating a bomb in the middle of her wedding. This is where everything unraveled. David stood up from the table, didn't say anything, just stood up and walked out of the reception hall. Emma called after him, but he didn't stop. She looked around the room at all these people staring at her. This moment she'd spent a year planning now completely destroyed, and she just ran. Grabbed her dress and took off after him. My mum was crying. My dad was yelling at Uncle Rick, who finally seemed to realize something had gone very wrong. The guests were all looking at each other, whispering, trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. I found Emma in the parking lot 20 minutes later. She was sitting on a curb in her wedding dress, mascara running down her face, and David was standing about 10 feet away from her, just staring at the ground. He looked gutted. I heard him ask her if it was true, and she nodded. Then he asked why she'd never told him, and she didn't have an answer. Or she had one, but it wasn't good enough. She said she'd wanted to tell him, but the longer she waited, the harder it got. She said she was scared he'd judge her, that he'd see her differently, that it was the biggest mistake of her life and she just wanted to move past it. David said he wasn't upset about the baby. He was upset about the lie. They'd been together for 4 years. They'd had conversations about wanting kids someday, about their future family, and she'd never mentioned that she'd already been pregnant before. He said he felt like he didn't actually know her, like their entire relationship had been built on this foundation of omission. Emma kept apologizing, kept trying to explain, but you could see it wasn't landing. The trust was just gone. The wedding basically ended right there. Some guests left immediately, others hung around awkwardly drinking at the open bar and pretending this was normal. The band packed up early. Emma's carefully planned reception turned into a funeral for her marriage before it even started. My parents tried to smooth things over, tried to talk to David, but he wasn't hearing it. He left the venue that night and went to stay with his brother. The full story came out over the next few days. Emma had gotten pregnant during her junior year of high school with a boyfriend she'd dated for like 3 months. She'd hidden the pregnancy from almost everyone except our parents and decided on adoption. It wasn't some dramatic scandal, just a scared teenager making what she thought was the best decision. After the baby was born, she'd moved to a different school district for her senior year, basically hit reset on her life and never talked about it again. When she met David in college, she convinced herself it was ancient history that didn't matter anymore. Except it did matter, not because of the adoption itself, but because she'd actively hidden it. David found out that she'd lied on intake forms when they went to a couples therapist once. She'd checked no when asked about prior pregnancies. She'd omitted it from medical histories. She'd constructed this entire alternate version of her past and maintained it for years. And David couldn't get past the fact that she'd looked him in the eye hundreds of times and chosen not to tell him. They're in therapy now, trying to salvage things. The wedding is technically still valid. They went through with the legal part before everything imploded, but they're basically separated. David's living with his brother. Emma's back at our parents' house. The marriage everyone thought was starting that night is instead in critical condition before it ever really began. Our family doesn't talk to Uncle Rick anymore. He's devastated, keeps apologizing, but the damage is done. He thought he was giving a touching speech about resilience, and instead he destroyed his niece's wedding and possibly her marriage. The thing that gets me is how preventable this all was. If Emma had just told David years ago when they first got serious, it probably would have been fine. He's not some judgmental person. He would have understood. But instead she built this lie, maintained it through an engagement and wedding planning, and forced him to find out in the most humiliating way possible. In front of his family, her family, all their friends, and now they're both paying for it. The worst part is watching Emma realize that the thing she was most afraid of, David judging her and seeing her differently, happened anyway. Except now it's not about a choice she made as a scared teenager. It's about the choice she made as an adult to hide it from the person she was supposed to trust most. The judgment she was running from caught up to her, but now it's about the lie instead of the truth. There's something almost tragic about it. She spent years protecting a secret that probably didn't need protecting, and in doing so, she created the exact outcome she'd been trying to avoid. Uncle Rick's drunk toast didn't just expose a secret. It exposed the gap between who Emma pretended to be and who she actually was, and David sitting with the realization that the person he married might not be the person he thought he knew. At least that secret came out accidentally. The next person, they deliberately set up an entire colleague to take the fall until technology turned them into the villain. I thought losing thousands of client contact records would be the worst part of my week. Turns out being framed for it by someone I considered a work friend was significantly worse. The whole thing started on a Tuesday morning when our systems team pushed through a routine update to our client management database. Nothing major, just some security patches and performance improvements. I'd seen these updates happen a dozen times before. They usually went smooth, no issues, business as usual. Except this time, when the system came back online, the entire client database was empty, just gone. Thousands of contact records, years of carefully maintained information, all of it vanished like it had never existed. Our customer service team noticed first when they couldn't pull up account information for incoming calls. Then sales realized they couldn't access their leads. Within an hour, it was full panic mode. Management was freaking out, IT was scrambling, and everyone was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. That's when Jennifer decided to helpfully point a finger directly at me. She walked into our manager's office and casually mentioned that she'd seen me working late the night before, that I'd been accessing the client database, and that I must have accidentally done something during the update. She said it with this concerned tone, like she was reluctant to throw me under the bus, but felt obligated to speak up. My manager called me in immediately, asked me point blank if I'd been working with the database recently. I told him no, I hadn't touched it in weeks. My projects didn't even require database access at the moment. He looked at me like he wanted to believe me, but the evidence was stacking up against me. Jennifer had been so specific about seeing me work late. She'd mentioned timestamps, talked about how stressed I'd seemed. She'd built this entire narrative, and I was standing there with nothing but my word to counter it. They suspended me pending investigation, told me to go home while IT conducted a full audit. I drove home in a daze trying to figure out what had just happened. Jennifer and I weren't close friends, but we'd always been cordial. We'd grabbed coffee together, collaborated on projects. I couldn't understand why she'd lie about something this serious. Turns out, I didn't have to wait long to find out. It started their investigation that same day. They pulled system logs, access records, everything that showed who touched what and when. Our company takes data security seriously, so every interaction with sensitive systems gets logged with timestamps, IP addresses, and user credentials. There's basically a digital paper trail for everything. I knew those logs would clear me because I genuinely hadn't accessed the database. What I didn't know was what they'd actually reveal. The IT director called an emergency meeting 2 days later. My manager was there, Jennifer was there, HR was there, and me. The IT director pulled up his laptop and started walking through what they'd found. The database had been accessed at 2:13 a.m. on Monday night. The access came from an IP address that traced back to a residential location, not our office. The user credentials matched Jennifer's login. But here's the thing, Jennifer's role didn't have admin access to the client database. She shouldn't have been able to touch it at all, let alone delete records. Jennifer's face went white. She started stammering about how that wasn't possible, that maybe someone had stolen her login information, that she'd been home asleep at 2 a.m. The IT director just kept clicking through screens, showing timestamp after timestamp. Jennifer had logged in using admin credentials that had been deactivated months ago when a senior manager left the company. Somehow she'd gotten hold of those credentials and kept them active. She'd used them to access the database remotely, systematically deleted files, and then tried to alter the access logs to make it look like my user ID had been responsible. But that wasn't even the worst part. The IT director pulled up chat logs from our internal messaging system. Jennifer had been talking to someone in a different department about my position. She'd said she was more qualified, that she deserved the role, that she just needed me out of the way. She'd literally typed out her plan to frame me for a massive data loss, to force my termination. The messages were right there, time-stamped, undeniable. I sat there watching Jennifer's entire scheme collapse in real time, and I didn't know whether to feel vindicated or horrified. She'd planned this. She'd stolen admin credentials, waited for a system update to provide cover, deliberately destroyed company data, and tried to pin it on me, all because she wanted my job. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a mistake that spiraled out of control. This was calculated sabotage. HR didn't even deliberate. They terminated Jennifer on the spot, called security to escort her out of the building. She tried to argue, tried to claim the chat logs were taken out of context, but nobody was listening anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. She'd committed what was essentially corporate sabotage and tried to destroy a colleague's career to cover it up. There was no coming back from that. I was reinstated immediately with a formal apology from management. They assured me the suspension wouldn't appear on my record, offered me additional PTO to compensate for the stress, and basically bent over backward to make things right. The database got recovered from backups within a few days. It had been running regular snapshots, so we only lost about 6 hours of data, which was manageable. The crisis Jennifer had manufactured ended up being more of an inconvenience than a catastrophe. What stuck with me wasn't the data loss or even the suspension. It was the realization that Jennifer had smiled to my face for months while plotting to destroy my career. We'd worked on projects together. I'd helped her troubleshoot problems. We'd complained about management over coffee. And the entire time she'd seen me as an obstacle to remove. The betrayal of it was almost worse than the actual framing. I found out later from a coworker that Jennifer had applied for my position twice before and been passed over both times. Apparently she'd taken it personally, decided I'd somehow stolen opportunities that should have been hers. In her mind, sabotaging me was justified because I'd wronged her just by existing in a role she wanted. The logic was deranged, but she'd fully committed to it. The whole situation taught me something valuable about workplace relationships. You can be friendly with coworkers, you can collaborate and build rapport, but you never really know what someone's thinking behind the professional facade. Jennifer taught me that some people will nuke the entire playing field if they think it'll get them ahead. And honestly, the scariest part wasn't that she tried to frame me. It was how close she came to succeeding. If our IT department had been less thorough, if they'd just taken her word and my suspension at face value, I could have been fired. My reputation would have been destroyed. I'd have been the person who accidentally wiped the client database, and that would have followed me to every job interview, every reference check. Jennifer was willing to end my career to advance hers, and she almost pulled it off. She handed them the rope and then tripped over it herself. All those careful plans, all that premeditation, and she didn't account for the one thing she couldn't manipulate. The system logs. Technology doesn't care about narratives or office politics. It just records what actually happened. And what actually happened was that Jennifer committed career suicide while trying to commit career homicide. Last I heard, she's working retail and still trying to explain the termination to potential employers. Meanwhile, I'm still at the company, still in my role, and significantly more paranoid about who I trust at work. Some lessons you learn the hard way. That kind of calculated betrayal takes real commitment. But you know what's even worse? When your so-called best friend is playing both sides just to watch the chaos unfold. When my girlfriend and I broke up after 3 years together, it was messy. Not dramatic, just painful in that way. Breakups are when nobody did anything particularly wrong, but it still fell apart anyway. We'd been growing in different directions, wanted different things, and finally admitted it wasn't working. The breakup itself was mutual, but the aftermath was complicated. Shared friend groups, shared belongings, shared memories that needed untangling. That's when my best friend Alex stepped in to help. Alex had been my friend since college. We'd lived together for 2 years, been through everything together, and he'd always been the rational one in our friend group, the mediator, the guy who could see both sides of any conflict and help people find middle ground. So when he offered to help me and my ex navigate the post-breakup logistics, it seemed like the perfect solution. He was close with both of us, had no stake in the outcome, and genuinely seemed to want us both to move forward without more pain. For the first few weeks, it actually seemed helpful. I'd give Alex messages to pass along to her about picking up belongings or handling our shared subscriptions. She'd send messages back through him. We were avoiding direct contact because it felt too raw, and having Alex as a buffer made everything feel more manageable. He'd check in with me regularly, ask how I was holding up, offer advice about moving on. He was doing the same with her, or so I thought, but things kept going wrong in ways that didn't make sense. I'd ask Alex to tell her I was sorry for how things ended and wanted to stay friends eventually. He'd report back that she'd said I was being manipulative and trying to guilt trip her. That stung, but I figured maybe she was just hurt and needed space. Then she'd try to return some of my stuff, and Alex would tell me she was being petty and weaponizing my belongings. I'd get frustrated and vent to Alex about it, and he'd sympathize, tell me she was being unreasonable, suggest I just let it go. Every interaction that went through Alex somehow made things worse instead of better. My ex and I went from sad but civil to actively hostile without ever actually speaking to each other. Our mutual friends started choosing sides. People who'd known both of us for years were suddenly treating this breakup like it had been a toxic disaster instead of just a normal relationship that ran its course. I started hearing rumors about things I'd supposedly said or done. She was apparently hearing the same about herself. The thing that really messed with my head was how supportive Alex was through all of it. He'd listen to me vent for hours, bring over pizza when I was having a rough night, give me advice about moving on and meeting new people. He kept saying that my ex was making things harder than they needed to be, that she was being irrational, that I deserved better. And I believed him because why wouldn't I? He was my best friend. He had no reason to lie. This went on for months. The anger between me and my ex kept building, fed by miscommunications and misunderstandings that all ran through Alex. I thought I was dealing with someone who turned bitter and vindictive after our breakup. She apparently thought the same about me. We'd gone from planning a future together to being unable to occupy the same space without tension, and neither of us really understood how it had gotten that bad. Then I ran into her at a coffee shop. Pure coincidence. I was grabbing my usual order and she was sitting at a corner table with her laptop. For a second, I thought about just leaving, avoiding the confrontation, but something made me walk over. Maybe I was tired of the hostility. Maybe I just wanted closure. I asked if I could sit down and she looked surprised but nodded. We started talking, really talking. For the first time since the breakup, we were actually communicating without a filter, and immediately things started not adding up. She mentioned an apology I'd supposedly sent that sounded nothing like something I'd say. I brought up the thing about her weaponizing my belongings, and she looked confused. She'd tried to return my stuff multiple times, and Alex had told her I didn't want it, that I'd said she could keep it or throw it away out of spite. That's when everything unraveled. We started comparing notes, messages Alex had claimed to deliver that never actually reached the other person. Conversations he'd summarized that bore no resemblance to what was actually said. Entire fabricated arguments he'd created out of thin air. The pattern became obvious fast. Alex hadn't been mediating. He'd been orchestrating. Every message got twisted. Every attempt at reconciliation got sabotaged. Every misunderstanding got amplified. We pulled out our phones and started going through text conversations with Alex. The differences were staggering. He'd tell me she'd said something cruel and cutting, then turn around and tell her I'd said something equally horrible. He'd manufacture conflicts where none existed. When one of us would try to de-escalate, he'd report the opposite to the other person. He'd been playing us against each other for months, carefully maintaining two completely different narratives. But that wasn't even the worst part. As we kept comparing messages, a bigger picture emerged. Alex had been positioning himself as her shoulder to cry on, offering comfort, suggesting coffee meetups to talk about the breakup, being suspiciously available whenever she was upset. The same supportive friend routine he'd been running with me, but with her it had an undertone I recognized. He was interested in her. He'd been interested in her for a while, probably since before we even broke up. The realization hit like a truck. Alex had seen our breakup as an opportunity. Step 1 was making sure we stayed broken up by preventing any chance of reconciliation. Step 2 was making me look terrible so she'd never consider getting back together. Step 3 was being her hero, the friend who understood her, who supported her through the horrible breakup with her manipulative ex. He'd weaponized our trust in him to destroy what was left of our relationship so he could try to build something with her. Imagine being this confidently wrong about how human relationships work. Like the sheer miscalculation of thinking you can manipulate two people who genuinely cared about each other and they'll never compare notes. The arrogance of believing you're clever enough to maintain two contradictory narratives indefinitely. We decided to confront him together, called him to meet up, told him we needed to talk about some confusion with messages. He showed up looking concerned and supportive, ready to play mediator again. Then we laid out everything, showed him the text comparisons, the fabricated conversations, the timeline of his manipulation. Watched his expression shift from confusion to panic to desperate denial. He tried to claim we were misremembering, that we were twisting his words, that he'd just been trying to help. We kept showing him evidence, his own messages contradicting each other, proving the lies. He switched tactics, said he'd just been trying to protect us both from saying things we'd regret. That fell apart fast when we pointed out the things he'd claimed we said that we'd never even thought. Finally, he tried the truth, said he'd developed feelings for her, thought we weren't right for each other anyway, and yeah, maybe he'd nudged things along, but he was just trying to help everyone find happiness. The rationalization was wild. He'd systematically destroyed our trust in each other, fabricated months of conflict, and poisoned our entire friend group's perception of our breakup. But in his mind, he was somehow the good guy, helping everyone get what they really needed. We both cut him off right there, told him we were done, that what he'd done was unforgivable, and that he needed to stay away from both of us permanently. He tried to argue, tried to apologize, but there was nothing left to say. You don't come back from that level of betrayal. My ex and I left together, leaving Alex sitting alone with the wreckage of his scheme. The aftermath was complicated. My ex and I didn't get back together. Too much had happened, too much time had passed, and honestly, the trust was damaged even if we now knew who'd really damaged it. But we were able to have closure. Real closure. We apologized to each other for the things we'd actually done wrong, forgave each other for the things that weren't our fault, and found a way to be genuinely okay with how things ended. Our friend group had to be informed about what Alex had done. Some people believed us immediately. Others needed convincing. A few people stayed friends with Alex despite everything, which honestly told me everything I needed to know about their judgment. The whole situation created fault lines that shifted our entire social circle. The wildest part is that Alex apparently tried the same thing with another couple months later. Same playbook, same manipulation tactics, except that couple had heard about what he'd done to us and shut it down immediately. He'd turned friendship-ending betrayal into his actual strategy for dating and couldn't understand why it kept blowing up in his face. Last I heard, Alex moved to a different city and basically had to start over socially. Turns out when you build relationships on manipulation and lies, they don't tend to be sustainable. Meanwhile, my ex and I are both doing fine. We're not friends exactly, but we're cordial. We can exist in the same spaces without tension, and we both learned a valuable lesson about trusting people who seem a little too eager to get involved in your problems. Sometimes the manipulation happens face to face. Other times it's hidden in plain sight, like a second phone that unlocks an entire alternate reality. My dad had always been a creature of habit. Sunday dinners at my place, phone calls every Wednesday to check in, the occasional weekend visit where he'd help me fix whatever was broken in my apartment. He was reliable, dependable. Or at least, that's what I thought. The phone he left behind after one of those Sunday dinners shattered that entire image. He'd rushed out to make some evening meeting he'd mentioned vaguely, left his phone on my kitchen counter. It started buzzing about 20 minutes after he left. I figured I'd glance at it, see if it was something urgent, maybe call him to come back for it. Except when I picked it up, something felt off immediately. The case was different, not the beat-up black leather one he always had, but a blue silicone case I'd never seen before. The wallpaper was a generic landscape photo, not the picture of our family from last Christmas that he usually kept. I stood there holding this phone, and my brain was trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Maybe he'd gotten a new phone and hadn't mentioned it. Maybe this was a work device? But my dad was semi-retired, did consulting from home. He didn't need a work phone. The screen lit up with another text notification, a message from someone named Linda, with a heart emoji next to her name. The preview said something about picking up groceries and asking what time he'd be home for dinner. Home for dinner. He'd just had dinner at my place an hour ago. I unlocked the phone using his birthday as the passcode, which worked on the first try. Terrible security, Dad. The messages from Linda weren't just casual. They were domestic. Conversations about bills, about parent-teacher conferences, about whose turn it was to do carpool. I scrolled back through weeks of texts and felt my hands start shaking. There were photos. My dad with a woman I'd never seen before. My dad with 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, at what looked like a birthday party. My dad in a living room I didn't recognize, sitting on a couch that wasn't the one in the house where I grew up. I opened his photo gallery and kept scrolling. Hundreds of pictures, family vacations I'd never heard about, holiday celebrations, school events, an entire life documented in photos, and I wasn't in a single one of them. Neither was my mum. Neither was my sister. This was a completely separate existence, running parallel to the life I thought he had. Then I found the calendar. 2 calendars, actually. One labeled home, which had events I recognized. Sunday dinners with me, anniversary plans with my mum, my sister's graduation that was coming up. The other calendar was labeled Elle's house. It had soccer games, dance recitals, date nights, family barbecues. He'd color-coded his double life. I sat down on my couch still holding this phone, and the sheer logistics of what he'd been doing started sinking in. 8 years. I checked the earliest messages I could find, and they went back 8 years. He'd been maintaining 2 complete families for almost a decade. 2 homes, 2 sets of kids, 2 women who presumably both thought they were married to a faithful man. The organizational skills alone were almost impressive, if it wasn't so completely horrifying. My dad came back for the phone about an hour later. I heard his key in my door, heard him call out asking if he'd left his phone there. I was still sitting on the couch, his second phone in my hand, surrounded by the evidence of his other life that I'd screenshot and sent to my own device. He walked into my living room, saw what I was holding, and I watched his face go through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. He started with denial, said it wasn't what it looked like, that I was misunderstanding. I held up the phone and asked him to explain the photos of him with 2 kids I'd never met. He switched to bargaining, sat down across from me and started talking about mistakes, about how things had gotten complicated, about how he loved both families and hadn't meant for any of this to happen. Hadn't meant for it to happen, like he'd accidentally maintained 2 families for 8 years, like he'd tripped and fallen into a whole separate life, complete with a mortgage and PTA meetings. And here's where it gets absurd. He actually asked me to keep quiet about it, said that telling my mum would destroy her, would ruin both families, that everyone was happy the way things were. Everyone was happy. I asked him if Linda knew about us. He got quiet. I asked again. He admitted that no, Linda thought she was his only family. She had no idea my mum existed, no idea I existed, no idea about any of us. So he hadn't just lied to my mum for 8 years. He'd lied to Linda too. He'd built this elaborate structure of deception where 2 entirely separate families existed in ignorance of each other, and he was the only person who knew the full picture. The audacity of asking me to help maintain that lie was almost breathtaking. I told him I was telling Mum everything. He started panicking, talking about how I'd be destroying the family, how my mum didn't need to know, how we could work this out privately. I asked him which family I'd be destroying, since apparently he had 2. He didn't have an answer for that. I called my mum that night, sent her the screenshots, showed her everything I'd found. I've never heard her that quiet. She didn't cry, didn't yell, just went completely silent for about 30 seconds. Then she said she'd call me back and hung up. My dad tried calling me 17 times that night. I didn't answer. My mum filed for divorce within a week, took the evidence I'd given her straight to a lawyer, started separation proceedings immediately. The house, the bank accounts, everything. She was done. But she didn't stop there. She found Linda's contact information from the phone records and called her, told her everything, sent her the same screenshots I'd sent my mum. Linda's world imploded just like ours had. Things went from bad to unhinged. Linda had thought my dad was a widow. He'd told her his first wife had died in a car accident years ago, that he'd raised his daughter, me, as a single parent until I went to college. I wasn't dead, I was very much alive, and his actual wife was also very much alive and currently divorcing him. Linda kicked him out immediately, called him every name in the book, threatened legal action, told him she never wanted to see him again. Both families fell apart in the same week. My mum was devastated but also furious, which somehow made it easier for her to move forward. Linda was apparently going through a similar process, according to mutual connections we discovered. The kids, both sets, were confused and hurt. My sister stopped speaking to my dad entirely. Linda's kids, from what I heard, were told an age-appropriate version that amounted to Dad lied about a lot of things and isn't who we thought he was. My dad tried to salvage something, reached out to both families, tried to explain, tried to apologize. Neither my mum nor Linda wanted to hear it. He'd burned both bridges so thoroughly there was nothing left but ash. Last I heard from my mum, he's living alone in a studio apartment across town, working full-time again because he's paying child support and alimony to Linda, and splitting assets with my mum in the divorce. I haven't spoken to him in months. He sends texts occasionally, trying to explain his reasoning, talking about how love is complicated. But there's nothing complicated about lying to 2 families for 8 years. There's nothing complicated about building an entire second life and maintaining it through systematic deception. That's not complicated. That's just selfish. The thing that still gets me is how close he came to getting away with it. If he hadn't forgotten that phone, If I hadn't unlocked it, he might have kept both families going indefinitely. He was organized enough, careful enough. It was pure chance that exposed him. And now 2 families are dealing with the aftermath of his choices, while he lives alone wondering how it all fell apart. Turns out you can't build a life on lies forever. Eventually you forget which phone is which, and the whole thing crumbles. At least that deception was personal. In the workplace, stolen credit can ruin careers, especially when someone's been quietly building their empire on your back. I spent 6 months watching my manager take credit for work I'd poured my heart into, and the worst part was how systematic it became. Diane had this routine down to a science. I'd email her my quarterly reports, my strategic plans, my client proposals, all polished and ready to go. She'd respond with a quick thanks, maybe a minor suggestion or two, and then I'd watch those exact documents get presented in executive meetings with her name at the top. Not as collaborative work, not as team efforts, as her individual contributions. The first time it happened, I thought maybe it was just standard management practice. Managers present their team's work. That's normal. But she never mentioned my name. Never said her team developed this, or one of her direct reports created that. She'd stand up in those meetings and talk about the research she'd conducted, the strategies she'd developed, the insights she'd uncovered. All of it mine. Word for word sometimes. I'd spent weeks on a competitive analysis report, and she presented it like she'd personally interviewed industry experts and crunched the numbers herself. I started noticing a pattern. Every time I delivered something substantial, Diane's visibility in the company increased. She got invited to bigger meetings. Executives started praising her strategic thinking. The CEO mentioned her innovative approach in a company-wide email. Meanwhile, I was stuck in the same position I'd been in for 2 years, getting passed over for promotions while my manager climbed the ladder on work I'd created. At first, I tried the diplomatic approach. I'd mention in emails that I was excited to see how the executive team responded to the proposal I'd developed. She'd edit those emails before forwarding them up, removing any indication of my involvement. I'd ask to attend the executive presentations to answer technical questions. She'd say my presence wasn't necessary, that she could handle any questions that came up. I suggested we co-present a major strategic initiative. She said it would be confusing to have multiple presenters and she'd take point. Every avenue I tried got shut down smoothly, professionally, with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but added up to the same result. My work, her credit. Then came promotion season. 3 positions opened up at the senior level, roles I was absolutely qualified for. I'd been with the company for 4 years, had stellar performance reviews, and had produced some of the most impactful work in our department. I applied for all 3 positions, didn't get a single interview. When I asked for feedback, HR said the competition was tough and they'd gone with candidates who had more visibility with executive leadership. More visibility. The irony was almost funny. 2 weeks later, the VP announced Diane's upcoming promotion, said she'd demonstrated unprecedented performance, that her strategic initiatives had transformed how the department operated, that her insights had directly contributed to the company's growth. I sat in that all-hands meeting listening to my own work being praised while attached to someone else's name, and something in me just snapped into focus. I wasn't going to complain. I wasn't going to plead my case or ask for fairness. I was going to document everything and let the evidence speak for itself. I'd already been keeping copies of my work, but now I got meticulous about it. Every email I sent to Diane, I BCC'd my personal email. Every document I created, I saved with timestamps showing the creation and modification dates. I kept version histories showing the evolution of projects from initial draft to final deliverable. I documented meetings where I'd presented ideas that later appeared in Diane's executive presentations. I built a comprehensive record of 6 months of systematic plagiarism. The VP announced Diane's promotion would be official in 2 weeks. That's when I requested a meeting. I told his assistant I had information about some deliverables that needed clarification before the promotion was finalized. She scheduled me for 30 minutes the following Tuesday. I showed up with a binder, printed emails, time-stamped documents, version histories, all organized chronologically. The VP seemed confused about why I'd requested the meeting. I told him I wanted to clarify the origin of some of the work that had been attributed to Diane in recent executive presentations. Then I opened the binder. I showed him the competitive analysis report Diane had presented as her own work. Then I showed him my email sending her the draft 2 days before her presentation, complete with timestamp. I showed him the version history proving I'd created the document from scratch. I walked him through a strategic plan she'd claimed to develop, then showed him my initial outline, my research notes, my drafts, all created weeks before she presented it. Then came the breaking point. I pulled out a client proposal that had won us a major account. Diane had presented it as her signature achievement, the work she was most proud of. I showed him 43 emails documenting my development of that proposal. Client research, competitive positioning, pricing strategy, risk assessment, all created by me. I showed him the original draft I'd sent Diane with a note saying I'd spent 3 weeks developing it. She'd presented it 2 days later, verbatim, with her name on it. The VP's expression shifted from polite interest to barely contained fury in about 10 minutes. He started taking notes, asking questions about specific deliverables. I had answers for everything because I'd actually done the work. I knew every detail, every decision point, every piece of research that had gone into these documents. I'd lived with them for months while creating them. He asked why I hadn't brought this up sooner. I told him the truth. I'd tried raising concerns diplomatically and got stonewalled. I'd hoped the quality of my work would speak for itself, but when you're invisible to the people making promotion decisions, quality doesn't matter. I'd finally realized that documentation was the only language that would cut through the politics. The meeting ran over by an hour. The VP called in HR. I went through everything again, this time with the HR director taking notes and asking even more detailed questions. They asked if I had copies of everything. I handed them a USB drive with every file, every email, every piece of evidence organized in folders by project. They thanked me for bringing this forward and said they'd be in touch. I went back to my desk feeling like I'd either just saved my career or completely destroyed it. The investigation moved faster than I expected. They interviewed other team members who confirmed I'd been the one developing these deliverables. They checked server logs that proved the documents originated from my computer. They reviewed email trails that showed the flow of work from me to Diane to executive presentations. The evidence was overwhelming. Diane was called into a meeting with the VP and HR 3 days later. I wasn't there, but I heard about it from someone who was. They confronted her with the evidence. She tried to claim she'd provided guidance and direction, that management meant taking ownership of team output. They showed her the emails where I'd sent her completed work that she'd then presented as her own creation without modification or acknowledgement. She had no defense. Her promotion was cancelled immediately. She was demoted back to an individual contributor role with no direct reports. The company released a statement to the executive team clarifying the actual source of the work that had been attributed to her. It was about as close to a public humiliation as corporate politics allows. 2 weeks later, Diane resigned. Couldn't handle the demotion, the loss of credibility, the knowledge that everyone now knew she'd been taking credit for her subordinates' work. She put in her notice and was gone within a month. I was promoted to her position. The VP personally apologized for not recognizing my contribution sooner. They gave me back pay to compensate for the recognition I should have received. They implemented new processes to ensure individual contributors got proper credit for their work, and they made it clear that my willingness to stand up for myself, to document everything, and to present evidence professionally had demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity they wanted in leadership. The whole experience taught me something important. Sometimes playing nice and hoping fairness will prevail just gets you exploited. Sometimes you have to build your case, gather your evidence, and force people to see the truth they've been willfully ignoring. Diane spent 6 months stealing credit, and it took me one 30-minute meeting with documentation to dismantle her entire fraudulent reputation. I don't feel guilty about it. She had every opportunity to do the right thing, to acknowledge her team's contributions, to lift others up instead of standing on their shoulders. She chose exploitation instead. All I did was make sure the truth caught up with her. Stolen credit is infuriating, but at least it's just professional. Money, though. Money tears families apart, especially when someone's been keeping score the whole time. When my Uncle Richard announced he was treating the entire extended family to an all-expenses-paid vacation in Hawaii, everyone lost their minds with excitement. 15 people, A full week in Maui, luxury resort, the works. My parents were crying with gratitude. My cousins were already planning excursions and posting countdowns on social media. The family group chat exploded with thank yous and heart emojis. Everyone was so grateful, so touched by his incredible generosity. Everyone except me, because I knew Uncle Richard, and Uncle Richard doesn't do anything without an angle. He's the kind of wealthy that comes with conditions, the kind of guy who'll buy you dinner and then spend the next 6 months reminding you how much he spent. He gives gifts with invisible strings attached, and those strings get pulled whenever it's convenient for him. So when he made this grand announcement about treating the whole family, my immediate thought was, what's the catch? What does he actually want? I kept my mouth shut though, partly because I had no proof, and partly because calling out potential ulterior motives when someone's offering a free Hawaiian vacation makes you look like an ungrateful jerk. So I smiled, said thank you, and quietly waited for the other shoe to drop. The trip started off normal enough. Beautiful weather, gorgeous resort, everyone excited and taking photos. Uncle Richard was in his element, playing the generous patriarch, soaking up the gratitude. Then, on day 2, he gathered everyone for a mandatory family meeting. Said he'd gotten us all tickets to an exclusive resort preview event that evening. It was a timeshare presentation, a 3-hour timeshare presentation that we were all expected to attend because he'd promised the sales team he'd bring his whole family. People grumbled but went along with it. We sat through 3 hours of high-pressure sales tactics while Uncle Richard networked with the presenters, talking about investment opportunities and dropping hints about his portfolio. Afterward, he seemed disappointed that none of us had signed up to buy timeshares. Like that had been the expectation. Then came the photos. Uncle Richard had apparently decided he was going to rebrand himself as a lifestyle influencer. Family man, successful entrepreneur, living his best life. He needed content, so suddenly every activity, every meal, every moment had to be documented for his social media. We had to pose for pictures at specific angles, had to wait to eat until he got the perfect shot of the table, had to redo candid moments because the lighting wasn't right. He'd caption everything with hashtags about family, gratitude, and living abundantly. And here's where it gets absurd. He wanted us to post too. Specifically, he wanted each of us to make posts thanking him by name, tagging his accounts, talking about his incredible generosity. He had suggested captions written out. He'd created a shared folder of photos we were supposed to use. This wasn't a family vacation. It was a content creation retreat where we were the unpaid labor. My cousin Jake was the first one to push back. Uncle Richard asked him to post a glowing review about the trip with specific talking points about Richard's success and generosity. Jake said no, just flat out refused, said he appreciated the vacation, but he wasn't going to turn his personal social media into an ad for Uncle Richard's brand. Richard's face went cold. He pulled Jake aside and told him that if he wasn't going to be a team player, maybe he should pay for his own airfare home. Jake thought he was joking. Richard wasn't joking. The tension started building. More demands kept coming. We had to attend a dinner where Richard was networking with potential business partners, basically serving as props to make him look like a successful family man. We had to participate in a beach photo shoot that took 2 hours because Richard wanted the perfect shot for his vision board. Every activity had strings attached. Every moment of relaxation came with expectations. I watched my parents getting increasingly uncomfortable. They'd been so excited about this trip, so grateful for Richard's generosity, and now they were basically working for him, performing gratitude on command, managing their expressions for his camera, thanking him repeatedly in front of strangers. It was exhausting to watch. Then I overheard a phone call. Richard was in the resort lobby, talking to someone about tax write-offs, about how the whole trip was going on his business credit card as a marketing expense. He was laughing about how he'd found a way to get a vacation and build his brand while writing off every cent. That's when I started asking questions. Quietly, carefully, I started piecing together what was actually happening. The trip wasn't a gift, it was a business investment that he was making us pay for in exposure and content. But that wasn't even the worst part. During a conversation with my mum, she mentioned something about a loan Richard had asked them to co-sign. Said he'd brought it up casually, mentioned that after everything he'd done for the family with this vacation, he hoped they'd help him out with this small favor. The loan wasn't small, it was substantial. And he was using the vacation as leverage to pressure them into guaranteeing his debt. That's when I decided I was done playing along. We had a big family dinner planned for the second to last night. Everyone dressed up, fancy restaurant, the whole thing. Richard stood up to give a toast about family and gratitude and how blessed we all were. When he sat down, I stood up. I thanked him for organizing the trip. Then I mentioned how interesting it was that the entire vacation was being charged to a business credit card as a marketing expense. How we'd all essentially been hired as unpaid content creators for his influencer rebrand. How he'd required us to attend timeshare presentations and networking dinners that had nothing to do with family bonding and everything to do with his business interests. I brought up the social media requirements, the stage photos, the scripted thank yous. Then I dropped the real bomb. I mentioned that he'd asked my parents to co-sign a loan as payment for this vacation, that the generous gift everyone was so grateful for came with a price tag of financial liability and free labor. The table went completely silent. People started looking at each other, putting pieces together. My aunt asked if the business expense thing was true. Richard tried to laugh it off, said I was twisting his words, that he'd never demanded anything from anyone. My mum quietly confirmed the loan request. One of my cousins pulled out their phone and showed the group the specific captions Richard had sent them to post. The facade cracked fast. People started speaking up about moments that had felt off. The timeshare presentation, the mandatory networking dinner, the hours spent on photo shoots, all the times Richard had reminded them how much money he was spending, how generous he was being. The pattern became undeniable. Richard tried to defend himself, said he'd given us an amazing vacation, and all he'd asked for in return was a little appreciation and some help with his business goals. Said families were supposed to support each other, that if we weren't willing to do these small favors after everything he'd done, maybe we weren't the family he thought we were. My dad, who almost never confronts anyone, told Richard that love and generosity don't come with invoices, that if he'd wanted business arrangements, he should have been upfront instead of disguising them as gifts. That pressuring family members to co-sign loans by holding a vacation over their heads was manipulative and wrong. Things went from bad to unhinged. Richard accused me of ruining the family vacation out of jealousy, said I'd always resented his success. Other people started pushing back, saying this wasn't about jealousy, it was about him treating the family like employees. The dinner ended with Richard storming out. Half the family followed him, trying to calm things down. The other half sat there processing what had just happened. The next day, Richard announced he was cutting the trip short, said the family had shown their true colors and he wasn't going to waste any more of his money on people who didn't appreciate him. We all scrambled to change flights. The ride to the airport was tense and silent. What was supposed to be a beautiful family bonding experience ended with everyone leaving early, angry, and divided. The fallout was immediate. Richard sent a group message saying he was done with the family, that we'd betrayed him, that he'd remember this. My parents didn't co-sign his loan. Most of the family stopped responding to his messages. The few people who stayed in contact with him reported that he was still playing the victim, still claiming he'd done nothing wrong. Looking back, the saddest part is that if he'd just been honest from the start, things might have been different. If he'd said, "Hey, I'm planning a vacation and building my brand," would anyone be interested in joining and helping create content? People could have made informed choices, but he needed the narrative of the generous benefactor. He needed people to feel indebted, and when that debt came due, the whole thing imploded. Nobody speaks to Richard anymore. The family learned an expensive lesson about strings-attached generosity, and I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is call out manipulation, even when it makes you the villain in someone else's story. Financial manipulation is one thing, but when someone's literal whereabouts don't match their story, that's when things get dark. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to check someone's location data. It felt invasive, controlling, like something you'd see in a true crime documentary right before everything goes sideways. But when your gut is screaming that something's wrong and the explanations you're getting don't add up, sometimes you ignore your principles and start looking for proof. It started on a Thursday night. I'd been working late, finally wrapped up around 11, and decided to grab food from this Thai place downtown before heading home. I was sitting at a red light when I saw her car, my girlfriend's car. distinctive because of the dent in the rear bumper from when she'd backed into a pole last year. It was parked in the lot of a Marriott hotel, just sitting there under the lights, unmistakable. My brain did that thing where it tries to rationalize what you're seeing. Maybe it just looked like her car. Maybe she was meeting a friend for drinks at the hotel bar. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I called her. She answered on the third ring, sounding normal, maybe a little rushed. I asked what she was up to. She said she was at her sister's place, that they were having a girls' night, watching movies and catching up. I asked if everything was okay, tried to keep my voice casual. She laughed and said, yeah, everything was fine. Why was I being weird? I told her I'd just finished work and was grabbing food. She said cool, she'd see me tomorrow, and we hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Thai place, food getting cold in the passenger seat, trying to make sense of it. Her sister lived on the other side of town, a good 25-minute drive from where I'd just seen her car. There was no reason for her car to be at a hotel downtown if she was across town at her sister's place, unless I'd been wrong about the car. But I knew that dent. I'd been there when it happened. I went home and barely slept. The next morning, I asked her casually how her night with her sister had been. She launched into this whole story about the movies they'd watched, the wine they'd drunk, some drama her sister was dealing with at work. Specific details, enthusiastic delivery. Either she was telling the truth and I was losing my mind, or she was an incredible liar. I let it sit for a day, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the image of her car in that parking lot wouldn't leave my head. So I did something I'm not proud of. We share a phone plan, one of those family plans that's cheaper than individual lines. It comes with location tracking, something we'd set up years ago for emergencies, for finding each other in crowded places, for the theoretical situation where one of us went missing. I'd never actually used it to check on her before. I opened the app and pulled up her location history for Thursday night. At 9 p.m., her phone was moving, traveling along the route from our apartment towards the downtown area. At 9:23 p.m., it became stationary. The pin on the map was dropped right on top of the Marriott Hotel. It stayed there completely still until 2:17 a.m. Then it moved again, traveling back along a route that led to our apartment. She'd been at that hotel for 5 hours. Her phone hadn't glitched. She hadn't stopped by briefly. She'd been there all night while telling me she was at her sister's house. I took screenshots of everything, the timeline, the map, the specific address. Then I sat with it for another day, trying to figure out what it meant. Maybe she'd met friends there. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. But the lie was the problem. If she'd been at the hotel for legitimate reasons, why lie about it? Why construct this elaborate story about her sister's place? When I confronted her, I didn't lead with the evidence. I asked her again about Thursday night, gave her another chance to tell me the truth. She repeated the same story. Girls' night, her sister's place, movies, and wine. I asked if she was sure that's where she'd been. She got defensive, asked why I was interrogating her, said I was being paranoid and controlling, accused me of not trusting her. That's when I showed her the screenshots, pulled them up on my phone and watched her face change as she realized what she was looking at. She went pale, then red, then started talking fast. Said her phone must have glitched, that location data wasn't always accurate, that there had to be some technical explanation. I showed her the timeline. 5 hours at the same location, multiple data points, the path showing her traveling there and back. But that wasn't even the worst part. She switched tactics, said, okay, fine. She'd met a friend at the hotel bar, hadn't thought it was a big deal, didn't mention it because she knew I'd overreact exactly like this. I asked which friend. She named someone I'd never heard of. I asked why she'd lied about being at her sister's. She said she hadn't lied, she'd gone to her sister's after the hotel. The story was falling apart in real time, and she kept trying to patch the holes with new lies. I told her I was done with the games, I needed the truth, or I was walking out right then. She started crying, said she didn't want to lose me, said she'd made a mistake. Then finally, she admitted it. She'd been meeting her ex-boyfriend. They'd been sleeping together for 3 months. The hotel was their regular spot because it was far enough from our neighborhood that they wouldn't run into anyone we knew. 3 months, a quarter of a year, all those nights she'd claimed to be working late, or at her sister's, or out with friends, all lies, all covering for the fact that she was maintaining a whole separate relationship while coming home to me and acting like everything was normal. I asked about her sister. She admitted her sister had been covering for her, providing alibis, backing up the lies. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. It wasn't just my girlfriend who'd been lying to my face for months. Her sister, who I'd known for years, who'd been at family dinners and holidays, had been actively helping her cheat. I ended it that night. Told her to pack a bag, that she could come back for the rest of her stuff later, but I needed her gone immediately. She tried to apologize, said it had been a mistake, that she wanted to work it out. But there was nothing to work out. She hadn't made a mistake. She'd made a choice over and over for 3 months. She'd looked me in the eye and lied systematically, while her sister helped cover the tracks. The wildest part came 2 days later when her sister called me. She was crying, apologizing profusely, said my ex had told her our relationship was basically over, that we were just going through the motions until we made it official. Said she'd been manipulated into thinking she was helping her sister get through a difficult breakup, not helping her cheat on an active relationship. I don't know if I believe that completely, but at least she had the decency to apologize. Location data doesn't lie. People do, constantly and creatively, but technology just records what actually happened. My girlfriend had built this whole alternate reality where she was faithful and I was paranoid, where my concerns were controlling behavior instead of legitimate questions about obvious lies. And she would have kept that reality going indefinitely if I hadn't happened to drive past that hotel at the exact wrong, or maybe right moment. The thing that still gets me is how normal everything seemed. She'd come home from those nights at the hotel and curl up next to me on the couch. We'd talk about our days, make plans for the weekend, act like a normal couple. The compartmentalization required to maintain that kind of double life is something I still can't fully wrap my head around. I heard through mutual friends that she and the ex-boyfriend didn't last. Apparently, once the affair lost its forbidden excitement, there wasn't much substance there. She tried reaching out a few months later, wanted to apologize properly, maybe talk about what went wrong. I didn't respond. What went wrong was pretty clear. She'd made choices that destroyed any foundation we'd built, and no amount of talking was going to rebuild that. Her sister still sends me an apology text every few months. I appreciate the gesture, but we're not going to be friends. Whether she knew the full truth or not, she was part of the machinery of lies that kept me in the dark, while someone I trusted used me as a safety net. The location data sits in my phone like a digital receipt for the end of that relationship. Sometimes I think about deleting it, but something keeps me from doing it. Maybe it's proof that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts were right. Maybe it's a reminder to trust my gut when something feels off. Or maybe it's just evidence that sometimes the truth is hiding in plain sight, in a location history log, waiting for someone to actually look. Technology really does catch everyone eventually, and sometimes the evidence isn't just in location data, it's sitting right there in Slack for anyone to subpoena. I thought I was about to lose my job over something I didn't do, and the helplessness of that feeling was overwhelming. Brian had started his campaign subtly, making little comments here and there about feeling uncomfortable around me, about sensing tension. Then he escalated, told HR I'd been harassing him, creating a hostile work environment, making inappropriate comments. He said I'd deliberately excluded him from important meetings and sabotaged his projects to make him look incompetent. He painted this picture of me as some kind of workplace bully, and HR took it seriously enough to launch a formal investigation. I got called into a meeting with HR, and my stomach just dropped. They told me someone had filed a complaint, that there were allegations of harassment and hostile behavior, and that they needed to investigate. They wouldn't tell me who filed the complaint initially, just asked me general questions about my interactions with team members, about my communication style, about any conflicts I'd had recently. I left that meeting feeling sick. I knew I hadn't done what they were describing, but how do you prove a negative? How do you prove you didn't say something or didn't do something when it's your word against someone else's? Then they told me it was Brian. That hit different because Brian and I had always been cordial. We weren't friends exactly, but we'd worked together fine for 2 years. No major conflicts, no tension I was aware of. We'd collaborated on projects, grabbed coffee occasionally, did the normal coworker thing. Finding out he was claiming I'd been harassing him felt like getting punched from a direction I hadn't seen coming. HR told me they were taking the allegations seriously and would be conducting interviews with other team members. In the meantime, I was being temporarily reassigned to work from home while they investigated. The implication was clear. They were treating me like I might actually be guilty. I went home that day and just sat there, trying to figure out what I'd done to make Brian hate me, enough to fabricate harassment claims. Then I remembered something. Everything at our company happens on Slack. Every conversation, every project discussion, every casual exchange gets documented in channels and direct messages. We live in Slack. If Brian had really been experiencing the harassment he claimed, there'd be evidence. And if he hadn't, there'd be evidence of that too. I looked up the company policy on data requests. Employees have the legal right to request their full Slack data export for personal records. It's meant to protect employees, give them access to their own communications. I submitted the request that night. The company has 72 hours to provide it. The export came through 2 days later. Thousands of messages, every channel I was in, every direct message I'd sent or received. I started searching for my interactions with Brian, looking for anything that could be construed as harassment or hostile. There was nothing. Our messages were professional, sometimes friendly, completely normal workplace communication. No inappropriate comments, no exclusions from meetings, no sabotage, just standard project coordination and occasional small talk. But then I started looking at Brian's messages with other people. That's when everything clicked into place. I found a direct message thread between Brian and another coworker, Tom. Brian had written out his entire plan, and I mean detailed step-by-step strategy. He said he wanted my senior position, and the easiest way to get it was to get me fired. He told Tom he was going to file harassment complaints because those were hard to disprove and would create enough smoke that HR would have to take action. He actually wrote that. Typed it out in a Slack message like he was planning a legitimate business strategy instead of attempting to destroy someone's career through false accusations. The messages got worse. Brian had strategized about which specific claims would be most effective. He said excluding someone from meetings was good because it's subjective and hard to verify. He said inappropriate comments worked because it's he said, she said. He talked about timing the complaint right before performance review season, so it would maximum impact on my standing in the company. He'd workshopped his false accusations like a marketing campaign. And here's where it gets absurd. Tom had actually pushed back, asked Brian if he was sure about this, if maybe there was a better way to pursue advancement. Brian had responded that playing fair took too long, that he'd been passed over for promotion twice, and that he wasn't going to wait around hoping merit would get recognized. He said the system rewarded people who knew how to work it, and filing a strategic harassment complaint was just working the system. I sat there reading these messages feeling like I was looking at evidence from another dimension. This person had calculated exactly how to destroy my career, had planned it out methodically, and had been stupid enough to document the entire conspiracy in company communications. The audacity paired with the sheer stupidity was almost impressive. I took screenshots of everything, the full conversation threads, the timestamps, the explicit admission of fabricating claims. Then I forwarded it all to HR and copied the legal department. I wrote a brief email explaining that I'd exercised my right to request my Slack data, had found evidence of false accusations being filed with malicious intent, and was providing documentation for their investigation. HR responded within an hour asking me to come in for a meeting the next morning. I showed up with printed copies of every message, highlighted and organized chronologically. The HR director and the legal counsel were both there. I walked them through the entire conversation thread, showed them Brian admitting he planned to fabricate harassment claims, showed him strategizing about which false accusations would be hardest to disprove, showed him explicitly stating his goal was to get me fired so he could take my position. The legal counsel's face went through about 5 different expressions while reading. The HR director looked like she wanted to put her head through the table. They asked if I had the original data export. I provided the full file. They verified the messages were authentic, checked the timestamps, confirmed it was really Brian's account. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. They didn't wait. They didn't deliberate. They called Brian into the office that afternoon and fired him on the spot. Terminated for filing false complaints, attempted fraud, and violating company ethics policies. Legal was apparently concerned about liability. If they'd acted on Brian's false accusations without properly investigating, and if I'd been fired or disciplined based on fabricated claims, the company could have faced a serious lawsuit. Brian tried to claim the messages were taken out of context, that he'd been joking with Tom, that it wasn't serious. They showed him his own words where he'd explicitly stated he was filing false harassment claims to get me fired. There's no context that makes that okay. He was escorted out by security that same day. The company settled with me before I even considered legal action, gave me a formal written apology for not vetting Brian's claims more carefully before launching an investigation, compensated me for emotional distress, made it clear the investigation into me was closed with no findings of wrongdoing. They also implemented new protocols for handling harassment complaints to prevent false accusations from gaining traction without preliminary evidence review. Tom, the co-worker Brian had confided in, got written up for not reporting the planned false accusations. He'd known Brian was planning to file fabricated complaints and hadn't told anyone. The company viewed that as complicity in attempted fraud. He stayed employed, but his reputation took a hit. I went back to work the following week, and it was surreal. Everyone knew something had happened, but not the full details. HR had kept the specifics confidential, just said there'd been a misunderstanding that was resolved. Brian was gone, I was back, and people were clearly curious but professional enough not to ask directly. The thing that stuck with me wasn't the anger, though I was furious. It was the realization that Brian had almost succeeded. If I hadn't fought to request my Slack data, if he'd been slightly smarter about not documenting his plan in company communications, his false accusations might have been enough to get me fired. HR was taking him seriously. They were interviewing people, building a case. The investigation was moving forward. I got lucky that he was arrogant enough to write out his entire scheme in Slack messages. But that luck was the only thing standing between me and a destroyed career. The system was ready to believe him, ready to act on accusations that had zero evidence, and I was supposed to just defend myself against claims I couldn't disprove. The experience changed how I think about workplace politics. I'd always believed that doing good work and being professional was enough. That merit would speak for itself. Brian taught me that some people view careers as zero-sum games, where destroying someone else is just strategy. And the scariest part? He almost won. False accusations are terrifying because they can stick. But what about when someone spends years building a false narrative about you to an entire family? That's when you fight back with receipts. For 2 years, I watched my extended family turn against me, based on lies my cousin Stephanie had carefully constructed. It started small, a comment here, a rumor there, whispered conversations that would stop when I entered the room. Family members who used to hug me at gatherings suddenly gave me tight smiles and kept their distance. Invitations to holidays started coming with caveats or stopped coming altogether. I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong until my aunt finally told me what people were saying. According to Stephanie, I was a monster. She'd told everyone I'd stolen money from our grandmother's estate while she was still alive. She said I'd refused to help during Grandma's illness, that I'd been too busy with my own life to visit or contribute. She painted me as this manipulative narcissist who only showed up when there was something to gain and disappeared when actual work needed to be done. The stories were detailed and consistent. Stephanie had clearly put thought into making them believable. The worst part was that our grandmother had passed away 6 months earlier. I couldn't defend myself to her, couldn't ask her to set the record straight. And apparently Stephanie had been feeding these lies to family members for over a year before Grandma died, so by the time I might have noticed the pattern, the narrative was already set. I tried defending myself at first, told people the accusations weren't true, that I'd actually been very involved in Grandma's care, but I didn't have proof on hand, and Stephanie's stories were already established. When you're defending yourself against lies, you sound defensive. When someone's accusing you with confidence and detail, they sound credible. I was fighting an uphill battle against a narrative that had already taken root. Family gatherings became torture. People would be polite but cold. Conversations would die when I joined them. I'd catch relatives looking at me with this mixture of disappointment and judgment. My parents believed me. Thank God, but even they were getting pressure from other family members about how they'd raised such a selfish daughter. The isolation was crushing. Then came Grandma's funeral. I'd helped plan it, had worked with the funeral home, and contributed financially to make sure it was exactly what she would have wanted. During the service, Stephanie gave a speech, talked about how much our grandmother meant to her, how she'd been there during the hard times, how she'd protected Grandma from toxic family members who only cared about themselves. She looked directly at me when she said that last part, just stared at me in front of 200 people, while implying I was the toxic family member she'd heroically protected our dying grandmother from. I sat there in the second row, feeling every eye in that room on me, and something inside me just broke. Not broke down, broke open. I was done being quiet, done trying to defend myself verbally, while she controlled the narrative. If she wanted to make this a public spectacle, I'd give her one. I spent the next week gathering evidence, bank statements showing every contribution I made to Grandma's care. $15,000 over 2 years for medical bills, home care, medications, everything insurance didn't cover. I pulled credit card statements showing payments to the meal delivery service I'd set up for her, to the house cleaning service I'd hired when she couldn't manage it herself. I gathered time-stamped photos from the hospital, from her home, proving I'd been there regularly. I collected text messages between me and Grandma, between me and her doctors, between me and the nursing staff. Then I looked at what Stephanie had contributed. Bank records showed zero financial contribution. Hospital visitor logs showed she'd visited exactly twice during Grandma's entire illness, both times for less than an hour. I had text messages from Grandma mentioning how she wished Stephanie would visit more often, how she understood Stephanie was busy but missed seeing her. And here's where it gets absurd. I found text messages between Stephanie and a mutual cousin from 18 months ago. Messages where Stephanie admitted she was spreading rumors about me because she was angry that I'd gotten a larger inheritance in Grandma's will. She literally wrote out her plan, said she was going to make sure the family saw me for who I really was, that I didn't deserve what Grandma had left me, that she'd make sure everyone knew I was a terrible person. The inheritance wasn't even that much larger. Grandma had left me an extra $10,000 specifically designated for my daughter's education fund, along with some jewelry that had sentimental value. Stephanie got the same base inheritance everyone else did, plus a generous amount. But that extra $10,000 had apparently been enough to trigger this 2-year campaign of character assassination. I created a private Facebook group and invited every single member of our extended family, 73 people. I titled it Family Truths and posted everything. Every bank statement, every hospital photo, every text message. I organized it chronologically so people could see the full picture. I included screenshots of Stephanie's messages admitting the lies. I wrote a brief introduction explaining that I'd stayed quiet for 2 years, hoping the truth would speak for itself, but silence had only let the lies spread. So here was the evidence. People could draw their own conclusions. I posted it at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday and turned off my phone. I couldn't watch the responses roll in, couldn't handle seeing the reactions in real time. I just needed it out there, needed the truth visible, and then I needed to step away. When I turned my phone back on the next morning, I had over 100 notifications. The Facebook group had exploded. Family members were commenting, apologizing, expressing shock. Some were angry at Stephanie. Others were angry at themselves for believing the lies without question. My aunt wrote a long comment about how ashamed she was for treating me coldly. My uncle said he owed me a massive apology. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in 2 years were messaging me privately, saying they felt terrible. Stephanie had left the group, didn't comment, didn't defend herself, just quietly exited. But other people shared that she'd called them, trying to do damage control, claiming I'd doctored the evidence or taken things out of context. Nobody was buying it. The bank statements were from official institutions. The hospital photos had metadata. The text messages were in her own words. There was no context that made any of it okay. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. My mum's side of the family basically excommunicated Stephanie. She was uninvited from the family reunion that was planned for that summer. People stopped responding to her messages. When she showed up to a cousin's birthday party, the host asked her to leave. The family had swung completely in the opposite direction, from believing her lies to freezing her out entirely. I received dozens of apologies, phone calls, messages, people wanting to meet for coffee to apologize in person. Some were genuine, people who'd been manipulated by someone they trusted and felt awful about it. Others felt performative, like they were apologizing because everyone else was, and they didn't want to be the only one who hadn't. But here's the thing, the apologies didn't fix anything. For 2 years, these people had looked at me with judgment, had excluded me from holidays, had whispered about me at family events. Some had cut me off completely, and they'd done all of that without ever asking for my side of the story, without giving me a chance to defend myself. They'd just believed Stephanie because her lies were compelling, and confronting them would have been uncomfortable. Now they wanted forgiveness, wanted things to go back to normal, wanted to pretend those 2 years hadn't happened. But you can't unring that bell. You can't take back years of coldness and exclusion and judgment. The relationships we'd had before were gone. What was left was just the awkward aftermath of people realizing they'd been wrong, but not knowing how to fix it. I accepted the apologies, said I appreciated people reaching out, but I didn't go back to family gatherings, didn't reinsert myself into the dynamics that had failed me so completely. Some bridges, once burned, stay ashes. You can acknowledge the fire happened, you can understand how it started, but that doesn't rebuild what was destroyed. Stephanie eventually moved to a different state. The family gossip network says she's doing fine, that she's built a new life away from all of us. I genuinely hope that's true, not because I forgive what she did, but because holding on to anger about it would just be giving her more of my energy. She spent 2 years trying to destroy my reputation out of petty jealousy over money. That says everything about her and nothing about me. The whole experience taught me something valuable about family. Blood relation doesn't guarantee loyalty or fairness or even basic fact-checking. People will believe what's easiest to believe, what fits their existing narratives, what doesn't require them to confront uncomfortable truths. And when you're the target of lies, you can either stay silent and let them define you, or you can gather your evidence and force people to see the truth. Neither option is easy. Neither option fully repairs the damage, but at least one of them lets you reclaim your story. At least I had evidence to fight back with. But imagine walking into a meeting and realizing, in real time, that you're not there for what you thought. You're the target. I got the meeting invite on a Wednesday afternoon. Subject line was urgent strategy meeting. Attendees included my boss and 2 senior managers from departments I'd never worked with. The body of the email was frustratingly vague. Just said they needed my input on Project Phoenix and requested I come prepared to discuss recent performance metrics. Project Phoenix wasn't even something I was involved with, but I figured maybe they wanted my perspective on something tangential to my work. I showed up 10 minutes early with my laptop and a notebook, ready to contribute whatever insights they needed. The conference room had that weird energy the second I walked in. My boss was sitting at the head of the table looking uncomfortable. The 2 senior managers, people I'd maybe seen twice in passing, were positioned on either side like this was an interrogation setup rather than a collaborative meeting. Nobody smiled when I entered. Nobody did the usual small talk about traffic or weekend plans. They just gestured for me to sit down and immediately started talking. Except they weren't asking for input. They were asking accusatory questions. Why had I been missing deadlines on client deliverables? Why had we seen an increase in client complaints about my team's work quality? Why was team morale so low that 2 people had apparently requested transfers? The questions came rapid fire, barely giving me time to process one before the next landed. I sat there completely blindsided, trying to figure out what reality I'd just stepped into. I hadn't missed deadlines. We'd actually been ahead of schedule on our last 3 projects. Client complaints? We had a 97% satisfaction rating. Team morale issues? My team had literally organized a happy hour the previous week to celebrate our recent wins. 2 people requesting transfers? That was complete fabrication. We'd actually just onboarded a new team member who'd specifically asked to join because of our department's reputation. Within 30 seconds of sitting down, I realized this wasn't a strategy meeting. This was an ambush. Someone had constructed an entire false narrative about my performance, and this meeting was designed to either get me to admit to problems that didn't exist, or catch me off guard enough that I'd react poorly and give them ammunition. I took a breath and stayed calm. Asked them to provide specific examples. What deadlines had I missed? Could they tell me the dates and which projects? They exchanged glances. My boss shuffled some papers and mentioned a client report that had allegedly been late. I pulled up my laptop and showed them the email where I'd submitted that report 2 days before the deadline, complete with the client's thank you response praising the thoroughness. What about the client complaints? They mentioned vague concerns about communication and responsiveness. I asked for the specific clients and complaint details. They couldn't provide them. Said the feedback had been informal, passed along through channels. I asked which channels. More vague responses. I offered to pull our client satisfaction surveys, our response time metrics, our feedback forms. Suddenly they weren't interested in looking at documentation. The team morale question was where things really started to crack. I asked them to tell me which 2 team members had requested transfers. They claimed that information was confidential. I pointed out that if my leadership was being questioned based on transfer requests, I had a right to know who'd made them so I could address any legitimate concerns. They said HR had the details. I asked if HR was aware of this meeting and these allegations. Silence. That's when everything unraveled. I realized my boss had orchestrated this entire setup without going through proper HR channels. He'd brought in senior managers from other departments to lend credibility, built a narrative based on fabricated or severely distorted information, and was trying to create a documented performance issue that could justify eliminating my position. This wasn't about my actual performance. This was about politics, budget cuts, or some other agenda I wasn't privy to. I stayed professional but direct, said I was confused about the nature of this meeting, since I'd been told it was about Project Phoenix and strategy input, but instead I was being confronted with performance allegations that didn't align with any documented metrics or feedback I'd received. I said I wanted to pause this meeting and involve HR directly, since these were serious allegations that required proper investigation and documentation. My boss tried to backtrack, said maybe there had been miscommunication, that they were just trying to get ahead of potential issues, that this was meant to be a supportive conversation. I wasn't buying it. The whole setup had been too deliberate, too coordinated. I said I appreciated the concern, but insisted on involving HR before we continued any discussion about my performance. I left that conference room and went straight to HR. Not my boss's preferred HR contact, but the director I'd worked with on previous projects who I knew would actually investigate properly. I laid out everything: the misleading meeting invite, the accusatory questions, the complete lack of documentation for any of the claims, the refusal to provide specific examples or involve proper channels. I requested a formal investigation. HR took it seriously. They pulled all my performance metrics, client feedback, team surveys, project timelines. They interviewed my team members. They reviewed the email that had invited me to the meeting and compared it to what actually happened in that room. The investigation took 2 weeks and concluded that there was zero evidence supporting any of the performance concerns that had been raised. Not only that, but my boss had violated company policy by conducting what was essentially a disciplinary meeting without HR involvement or proper documentation. My boss got formally reprimanded. Not fired, unfortunately, because corporate politics protect people at certain levels, but reprimanded enough that it went in his permanent file. I was offered the option to transfer to a different department to get out from under his management. I took it immediately. My new role is actually better team, better projects, better leadership. But the trust was broken. I couldn't stay in a department where my boss had tried to manufacture a reason to fire me. I'm now working with employment lawyers to assess whether there's grounds for further action. Attempted wrongful termination setup is apparently a thing, and it creates liability for companies who don't handle it properly. My lawyer seems to think we have a solid case, especially given the documentation I kept from that meeting and the HR investigation results. The wildest part is how close it came to working. If I'd walked into that meeting less prepared, if I'd gotten defensive instead of staying calm, if I'd agreed to any of their vague characterizations of problems, they could have documented it as me admitting to performance issues. They could have built their paper trail and pushed me out within a month. The whole scheme relied on me being caught off guard enough to either admit to fabricated problems or react poorly enough to create real ones. Looking back, there were signs I'd missed. My boss had been increasingly distant for weeks. He'd stopped inviting me to certain meetings. He'd started CCing senior leadership on emails that didn't really need their visibility. He'd been laying groundwork, building relationships with the people who'd eventually sit in that conference room and help him try to take me down. I just hadn't recognized the pattern until I was sitting in the trap. The experience taught me something valuable about corporate politics. Some people will smile to your face while constructing your professional demise behind your back. They'll use meetings as weapons, documentation as ammunition, and bureaucracy as cover for personal agendas. The only defense is staying calm, demanding specifics, involving the right people, and keeping your own receipts. I kept every email from that period, every project timeline, every client feedback form, every team communication. When they tried to build their false narrative, I had the documentation to dismantle it point by point. That's what saved me. Not luck, not intervention from above, just obsessive record keeping and refusing to accept vague accusations as fact. My former boss still works there. We occasionally pass each other in the building. He doesn't make eye contact. I heard through the grapevine that he tried something similar with another team member a few months later, but HR shut it down immediately because they were already watching him. Apparently, once you've been caught trying to set someone up, you lose the benefit of the doubt on future accusations. And that's the thing about setups. They only work if you don't see them coming. If you've made it this far into the chaos, I hope you're feeling a little better about your own life. Sometimes the best therapy is knowing someone else's drama is way worse than your Monday morning meeting or that awkward family text thread. These stories remind us that truth has a weird way of surfacing, whether it's through Slack logs, location data, or a drunk uncle with terrible timing. The liars and manipulators always think they're smarter than everyone else, right up until the receipts come out. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, keep your receipts, trust your gut, and maybe think twice before giving your brother your social security number. I'll be back soon with more Reddit chaos that'll make you grateful for your boring, drama-free life. Until next time, stay petty, stay smart, and whatever you do, don't forget to check those Slack messages before you hit send.